If I could ask everyone to take their seats. I've got a nice loud microphone this morning. Everybody can hear me. My name is Jeff Eisenach. I am the director of AEI's Center for Internet Communications and Technology Policy. It's a pleasure for me to welcome everyone here this morning for today's event, Who Governs the Internet? A conversation on securing the multi-stakeholder process. Governs is kind of a big word in that sentence, isn't it? I'm not sure we're governing very much, but hopefully we're guiding it in the right direction, and that's what we're here to talk about today. I had the pleasure many years ago, almost 20, I guess now, of working with a fellow named Ira Magaziner in the Clinton White House and Department of Commerce. And these were the early days of the internet. I was running a little think tank called the Progress and Freedom Foundation. And Ira, who had actually been in charge of President Clinton's initial efforts at healthcare reform, which didn't turn out very well, had been shunted over to the Department of Commerce, where he was put in charge of this little backwater issue called electronic commerce, global electronic commerce, and it turned out that meant the internet. So the next thing you know, Ira is trying to figure out how to wrestle with the fact that the internet at that time, mid-1990s, was emerging from this kind of research project with a bunch of academics and scientists communicating big data from across university campuses and using it for such important things as does anybody know what the first webcam was? The first webcam was set up at MIT by the scientists there who were using the internet, and it focused on the coffee pot. And the purpose of the webcam was to let them know when there was a fresh pot of coffee down the hall, so they could walk down the hall and get. So that was the early days of internet commerce. Was the coffee pot webcam. And at that time, as the internet broke out from a hobby, or whatever it was, into what's become the most important economic and social technological development of our lifetimes and arguably in human history if you overlook fire. The question was, how do we govern it? What do we do with it? It had been a project at that point of the National Science Foundation through a grant to one guy, John Postel, who literally on his PC kept a list of who had which top-level domain names. That system wasn't going to work going forward. And Ira, to his tremendous credit, went out and organized a process which is very much the same kind of process that I think we go through today. It was a process that engaged all the stakeholders, everybody, which is almost literally everybody, with a stake in how the internet is going to develop going forward, recognizing that it is inherently not the property of any single entity and certainly not of any single government, and established, at the end of the day, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. A lot of people were nervous about that at the time because it is what it is. It's not exactly clear who it's accountable to. Indeed, the whole process is amorphous, ambiguous, and hard to get your arms around. People who have been to ICANN meetings can, I think, testify to that with greater color and, than others. But it was the alternative to something else. And the something else was that there was this thing, which is still around, still lurking, still grasping, called the International Telecommunications Union, and it had a different plan, and that was it would run the internet. It was, after all, nothing but a fancy telephone network in their eyes, and all of these government-owned telephone companies who have voting control of the International Telecommunications Union thought it would be a great idea to get their hands on it, and as Ira said to me one day in 1998, shut it down, because the last thing they wanted was that kind of competition. So there we were in 97, 98, and began a process which continues to this day. And by and large, it's been a successful process. If you look at the internet, it hasn't turned out too badly in a lot of respects. And yet the challenge of where we go from here is apparent. The internet is a global entity, an international entity. It lives in the space, the interstices between sovereignty and individual action, between markets and communities. And the United States has very clear and strong interests in how it develops in a very chaotic world. So I have no answers to any of these questions today. I will tell you that here at AEI, we've decided that they're important questions. We've brought Shane Tews aboard to direct a project that's ongoing over the course of the next couple of years, where we are going to be working to develop an agenda for internet freedom going forward into the rest of the 21st century. And today's conference is a part of that ongoing effort. So I've now talked enough. I'm going to get out of the way here and introduce our first panel, our first speakers, and we are delighted to have our first speakers, to have these people here with us. Daniel Sepulveda is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and U.S. Coordinator for International Communications and Information Policy in the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. He's been involved in issues of internet governance for many years through his positions particularly on the Senate Commerce Committee, where, among other things, he has been a close and very senior advisor to then Senator and now Secretary of State John Kerry, who there's a guy with a few things on his plate this week, huh? Ambassador Sepulveda has agreed to participate in an interview format as opposed to the usual stand up and take questions deal, which we're delighted by, and we look forward to hearing him be interviewed by David McCauley. Those who are familiar with internet governance issues are no stranger to David, who is legal editor for Bloomberg's Electronic Commerce and Law Report, and a frequent both writer on these issues and a participant in events like this. And David, we look forward to your conversation with Ambassador Sepulveda. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. Ambassador Sepulveda, welcome.
Sir, thank you.
My thanks to Jeff, to Shane, and to the sponsors for this opportunity. And so let's begin. We heard Jeff describe your position. Would you kindly set the table and tell us about your remit, what it is that comes under your purview and the efforts that you have underway?
Absolutely. Before I start, I'd like to also thank AEI and thank Jeff and Shane, who's a dear friend and has brought us together here. I also want to note that there are a number of people in this room, some of whom will be on your panel later, but others as well, who have dedicated themselves to this endeavor and have as much knowledge or more knowledge than I do on these subjects, and would love to open it up for conversation at some point in the process. As it relates to my specific task and job, what I do is coordinate communications and information policy in front of the world for the United States, and I do that in collaboration and coordination with my colleagues across the interagency. Assistant Secretary Larry Strickling, both a friend and a mentor, is the senior advisor to the President on telecommunications issues, who work very closely and collaboratively. He has predominant responsibility for ICANN-related issues. I have predominant responsibility for ITU-related issues, but we do coordinate and work very closely to ensure that we're working together towards the same end. And so the question is, well, what is that end? And at the end of the day, my responsibility is, in the first instance, I'm located within the Economic Bureau of the State Department. So I have to ensure that American firms, American engineers, American technologists are treated fairly abroad. And I have to make sure that there's a legal and regulatory environment, particularly an international legal and regulatory environment, that encourages investment in innovation and the underlying infrastructure that enables the deployment of networks and the services that ride over those networks. So that creates both multilateral challenges in places like the ITU, but also at the OECD, APEC, OAS, and other international institutions, as well as in market-to-market individual situations. So, for example, we had a challenge in Brazil, both on the multilateral and bilateral front, but the issue I'm thinking of was the the data localization provisions that were in the original Marco Civil, which were through a combination really of external and internal, essentially making the case that imposing data localization requirements would, at the end of the day, harm Brazil by raising the costs of providing services to small and medium-sized enterprises in Brazil and the delivery of the underlying economic goals that Brazilians want to have, that we were able to remove that language from that particular bill, or the Brazilians agreed to do so. So that's one example, and in a 20-second sort of summary of the remit.
Thank you. With that background, we are here today to discuss internet governance writ large and also the preservation of the multi-stakeholder model of governance. And so with that in mind, can you give us what you use as a working definition of those two terms, internet governance on the one hand and the multi-stakeholder process of governance on the other?
Yes, and I think that to some degree it's confusing because it implies a singular framework, internet governance being one thing and the multi-stakeholder institutions being one thing, and they're not, right? Internet governance implies many, many, many things. What ICANN does, for example, is manage the critical infrastructure resources necessary to ensure that there's coordination and collaboration among the users of the internet, the engineers who create the protocols, and the ability to ensure that every device is unique on the network and that every domain name resolves to a specific site. So that is a very four corners mandate for ICANN. It does not govern how people use, distribute, or collect information on the internet. It does not build networks. It does not provide for general accessibility for the world to networks. And those are all also challenges under the construct of what you would constitute internet governance. Professor Joseph Nye out of Harvard recently wrote a paper for the CG project that Carl Bildt is running out of Canada that breaks these issues down and identifies how different institutions play a role in each of these separate issues that all compose an aspect of internet governance, and how different incentives and pressures yield greater or lesser collaboration relative to any given issue within the framework of what we call internet governance. Professor DeNardis, who wrote an excellent book titled The Global War for Internet Governance, also breaks it down and talks about the fact that it is very difficult to ask the question, who governs the internet, because certainly no one person, no one institution, no one stakeholder governs the internet. It is a complex interaction of diffuse and distributed institutions and private contractual decisions that lead to both the construction, the operation, and the activity on the internet. As it relates specifically to the multi-stakeholder process for internet governance, as Jeff talked about, it was essentially created out of an organic process, in part through the establishment of ICANN in the first instance, and that is the most common and most commonly used idea for how a multi-stakeholder process works. And the idea in the multi-stakeholder process is that it's essentially a form of participatory democracy, right? All the stakeholders in the process of governing the coordination and collaboration of the underlying essential functions of the internet work together to ensure that there's rough consensus by which that occurs, and they execute it through the board of ICANN. The board of ICANN is selected by the constituency itself. There is a government advisory committee to the board, and there's a president, and then of course there's the IANA contract between NTIA and IANA. But the other institution that we've talked about here and will come up, I assume, in the rest of our conversation, is the International Telecommunications Union, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary next year. It was originally the International Telegraph Union 150 years ago, and manages much of the underlying infrastructure or the rules that relate to telecommunications, interconnection, and interoperability, phone-to-phone communications, satellite communications, and is also responsible for the allocation of how spectrum is used in any given band internationally, which is incredibly important for the wireless deployment of broadband, among other things, the operation of broadcasting and satellites. And then, of course, the ITU does have a development branch in which what they do is ensure that policymakers around the world have access to the best practices necessary for creating legal and regulatory environments that encourage competition, encourage investment, and encourage deployment of the underlying network.
Thank you. I do intend to ask you about some ITU events, and I'm going to start that in a minute. But just let me, as I get to that, let me ask you a little bit about ICANN, which you just brought up. ICANN does deal with the address book of the internet, so to speak, the names and numbers. But it is also a lever. It has an outsized power in this respect. The American Bar Association section on intellectual property law just referred to the DNS, the domain name system, as a kill switch in which any one website could basically be taken out of action. And so ICANN exercises some considerable, or it is the focus of some considerable interest among people at the ITU as all these gatherings get together. Is that a fair statement?
ICANN is an incredibly powerful institution because it has hard power, and that hard power is relative to the assignment of domain names and the obligations that are implied for the registrar for the management of domain names. That said, it's not the only choke point in the network, and essentially you get pressures at every choke point in the network, right? The challenge becomes ensuring that no single stakeholder tries to exert outsized authority through a manipulation of any given choke point in the network. So while the domain name itself could be a choke point in the network, obviously search engines can be a choke point in the network. The broadband service provider itself could be a choke point in the network. The goal is to ensure that you're creating an environment in which all stakeholders are, if not equally, significantly responsible and responsive to each other's needs, so that the network itself continues to be global and as free and open as is possible.
Getting on to the ITU, let me parenthetically mention that towards the end of this hour, we will open this up to questions or comments from the floor. Getting towards the ITU, this is as we all know, an incredibly busy and intense time under the aegis of the concept of internet governance. And I would argue that this present intensity may be bookended on the front end by the World Conference on International Telecommunications at the front end, December 2012. And at the back end, it may be by the combination of the ITU plenipotentiary and the WSIS, the World Summit on the Information Society 10-year review next summer. Could you talk to us a little bit about the fallout from the WCIT conference, where unusually the ITU didn't reach consensus but had a vote, I think it was 89 to 55, on revisions to the international telecommunication regulations. But is there fallout from that conference? You came on board just after the conference. I remember discussing it with you in a coffee shop where I almost missed the appointment by being a little bit late. But in any event, tell us about WCIT and what it means to you going forward.
So the WCIT was a critical inflection point in this conversation. My predecessor and esteemed colleague, Phil Revere, who is now at the FCC, managed the delegation to that event. And there was an extreme amount of preparation that went into that event. One of the things that we were surprised by was that even though we had been told two things: one, that there would not be voting, and two, that internet issues would not be on the table, both things occurred. So for those who were on that particular delegation, there's some form of post-traumatic stress syndrome. I mean, you talk to these folks and you say the word WCIT and they start shaking a little bit. Now, since that occurred, there has been a recognition, I believe, significantly on the part of the ITU leadership, but among the union delegation representatives themselves, that a union cannot stand if it is divided. And the vote itself was harmful to the health of the union itself. Since then, we've had a number of events at the ITU. I've headed all of them. The World Telecommunications Policy Forum, where we decided on 6 separate principles related to issues of telecommunications, which was developed through a multi-stakeholder advisory process that then fed those proposals to the ITU and was affirmed and approved by the membership of the ITU. We've had 2 ITU councils, again, consensus-based achievement decisions. We've had the World Telecommunications Development Conference, again in Dubai earlier this year. Again, consensus-based decisions and no real challenges that occurred as they did in Dubai. So the trend lines are extremely positive. And the division that you saw at the WCIT, for example, where we lost, where we were on the other side of our friends in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, much of Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, at Net Mundial earlier this year, when Brazil and the internet community brought everyone together to talk about what are going to be the principles guiding us moving forward in the roadmap for the future of internet governance, the first principle decided upon was the multi-stakeholder process as being the underlying guiding factor for internet governance. All of the countries I just mentioned were in agreement with that. I think that was a huge, huge success for us and established a precedent that we could go into plenipotentiary with and let our colleagues know that, yes, the ITU is an honorable organization with an immense amount of good work to do, particularly in encouraging the deployment of the networks and legal and regulatory underlying environments that encourage investment in networks, but that its remit is limited. It is the International Telecommunications Union. It is not the International Internet Union. There are many, many challenges that we have to face relative to the global internet that we're dealing with because it is a relatively new phenomenon, as not just as governments, but as industry and civil society and academia, and that there are other mechanisms by which to address those specific issues, and that we should be working within those mechanisms to address those issues, and that the ITU should be focusing its budget and efforts specifically on its remit relative to telecommunications infrastructure.
When you came on board, I've heard you speak several times about one thing that came out of the wicket, and that is efforts on your part to talk to nations who should be in concert with our thinking on the multi-stakeholder process, the United States thinking on the multi-stakeholder process, but they were on the fence, or maybe they were on the other side. How are those efforts going?
Again, I think that if you look at Net Mundial and the consensus achieved at Net Mundial, that they're going very well. It takes an immense amount of effort, not just on my part, but on my colleagues' part at all of our agencies, as well as in the private sector. And at ICANN itself, which is the most obvious face of the multi-stakeholder process, Fadi Shahadi, the president of ICANN, who I believe you know personally, has done an excellent job of opening up offices around the world and doing an extensive amount of outreach to particularly parts of the global south that have some degree of skepticism about how well the multi-stakeholder process is working for them. So we do this on multiple fronts. Just yesterday, I did a digital video conference with leaders from Nigeria and opened it up to the entire community to talk about how efforts are going in Nigeria to ensure that we have a growing multi-stakeholder process and multi-stakeholder community participating out of Africa in these processes. And we're going to be doing that. I'll be going physically to many places in the world. Next week, I'll be in Peru and Colombia. We're going to be doing a 2-day event. In Colombia, Colombia is an excellent case study of success where a global South nation has taken some very innovative and creative steps to encouraging the deployment and use of the network. So my colleague and counterpart there, Diego Molano, has encouraged through reverse auctions the deployment of the network to rural areas, and they have 90% of Colombia connected at this point. Through tax policy, he's encouraged the consumption of computers and tablets, and through a variety of different local community mechanisms for the increase in digital literacy, he's encouraged the use of the network for people for productive purposes. So, for example, just yesterday, or 2 days ago, he tweeted about a 61-year-old woman in Colombia who had learned to sew watching YouTube and was now gainfully employed and making products out of her home. So that's just an example of one example, and we've seen similar examples in Rwanda, Nigeria, Ghana, in other parts of the world where the network is being used for development purposes, and people are seeing that it's a platform for the creation of wealth and the distribution of knowledge, not an end in and of itself.
During these efforts that you've been making, did you notice any impact of the revelations of massive surveillance? Did that set you back? Even though the two issues may not translate one-to-one, did it have an impact on your ability to convince countries about the multi-stakeholder process?
What it did was create a challenge relative to people just accepting on face value arguments that we're making. Right? There's an inherent and traditional and historic skepticism about the power of not just the United States, but the West in general, relative to the global South and how we exercise that power. So it has created some challenges, particularly in relationship management, But the issue of how intelligence is collected and used is really a conversation for intelligence officials. The specific technology used to exercise those authorities is not as relevant as the norms and the propriety of using that in any given space. And that question of intelligence operations is not for communications ministers. That's not where their expertise lies. And it's not where we spend our time talking about, right? What the challenge that I've had to face is to present to the world our commitment as being real and substantive to connecting the entire world. And the fact of the matter is that the internet as a network industry, the addition of every user adds value for every other user. We have no self-interest in denying access to the internet. We want to see it proliferate throughout the world. We want to see innovative and new uses for it that are applicable around the world, and the creation of wealth using the platform all over the world. And when we talk about the internet, we're not just talking about the World Wide Web. When the internet, Facebook, Google, even the World Wide Web itself are simply applications on the internet. The future of the internet is about the Internet of Things, about supply chain management, about ensuring that you have the data necessary to deliver healthcare services well and government services well, so that cars don't crash into each other, so that planes fly more efficiently. There is an immense amount of things that will reap dramatic returns, not just for us, but for the entire world, if we manage this particular form of communications well. And at the end of the day, we believe strongly that the record indicates that that means that you allow it to manage generally itself.
I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the plenipotentiary coming up, which is a meeting of all member states of the ITU, whereas the council, I believe, is some 40 representatives.
Correct.
And they meet every 4 years. Could you tell us a little bit about the process, about the agenda, how it's set, about the tranches of positions of the different countries, how they're forwarded, and what your expectations are as to what might be the major issues coming up? And by the way, it is at the end of October, first week in November this year.
That's correct. So the plenipotentiary occurs every 4 years, and it's essentially the Constitutional Convention of the International Telecommunications Union. And it establishes, at that event, you can move to modify the Constitution and conventions, which are the governing documents of the ITU, as well as the resolutions. And you set a plan of work for the following 4 years for the union as a whole, and then the ITU Council meets intermittently to execute on it.
And you establish finance too, I think.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the plenipotentiary will be broken out into 3 weeks. The first week will be predominantly elections. There will be a turnover of the leadership. The current Secretary General is termed out. There are a number of people running for DepSec. There are also a number of people running for the different branches, the ITUR, the ITUD, and the ITUT, which are respectively the radio communications, the development, and the standard-setting branches of the ITU. So the first week will be taken up with a lot of campaigning and political discussions and trying to assimilate votes to ensure that you have the right person in each of these given positions. The following 2 weeks, the work is broken out by committees. There are 6 committees, and there's a working committee of the plenary. Some of them are intensely bureaucratic in the sense that they're about budgeting and other issues, but nonetheless, those are important because one of our key arguments here is that the financial resources of the union should remain committed to its essential functions rather than running off and trying to do things that other people are doing well and duplicating or undermining that work, but focusing on its essential tasks. Within the body of the working group of the plenary, you will see efforts, not new efforts, but efforts by some to inject a number of internet-related issues into the conversation. Among them will be cybersecurity issues, issues related to child online protection, issues related to the distribution of internet protocol addresses. There may be some issues raised relative to ICANN. Now, each region goes through a preparatory process by which they make a presentation to the ITU of proposals. We are going through our own inter-American process. That's partly why I'm going to Peru and Colombia next week, but we will be gathering in Paraguay later this year and then finally in Argentina to make inter-American proposals to the union. And we're working on a number of different things. In the first instance, what we're trying to do is make clear that the region as a whole is agreed that we should not see votes again. that every decision made at the ITU will have to be made by consensus. And secondly, that the region as a whole is committed to ensuring that we stay within the remit of the ITU. And that will be part of what we do through our Inter-American process. Now, you've seen other regions going through their processes, and to date, none have produced the kinds of proposals that we have feared having a long and painful debate about. Now, I expect that those from somewhere, whether that be the Russia contingency or the Middle East, that someone will be producing those debates. The challenge here is not to end disagreements in the world, but to ensure that we're in the majority and that we have with us particularly developing country democracies, because they share our values and they share our goals. And none of them, and we obviously don't want to see the centralized authority of Geneva or the International Telecommunications Union exercised to engage in censorship or in political oppression. And so as long as we're united on that space, I think we'll be all right.
I see. Prior to the wicket, former Federal Communications Commissioner Robert McDowell focused some warnings on two themes largely. One was that the multi-stakeholder process is fairly fragile and can suffer death by 1,000 cuts. And another was changes to definitions and governing documents could have a big impact. And his concern then was bringing the internet into the international telecommunications regulations. Now we turn to the ITU plenipotentiary and the governing documents, the Constitution, the conventions. Is there any chance, or is there a likelihood that it will come up to inject a definition for ICT, information communications technology, as a term that might carry some internet into that framework?
There's certainly, it's a certainty that someone will raise the proposal. The region as a whole, I believe, or at least the Americas as a whole, will agree to oppose that proposal. I believe we will have the support of Africa as well on that front. And the African regional preparatory process was recently completed and no such proposal was made. So I do believe that someone out of the more authoritarian regimes will make a proposal toward that end. There was a working group looking at the question that was constructed by the ITU Council and was not able to reach a conclusion. So again, I think that we will be well on the side of the majority objecting to a change in the definitions that would inject the ICT into the process. A word on Commissioner McDowell, who is a friend and has dedicated an immense amount of energy and efforts to this space. He also participated on a panel that ICANN constructed that was headed by President Ilves of Estonia, which produced a report trying to construct a path forward by which we can construct an alternative mechanism that isn't ICANN, is apart from ICANN, but is a space in which to construct and address some of the outstanding issues or provide direction for nations who want to address issues that are to some degree contentious or outside the remit of the International Telecommunications Union. And there's ongoing work in that space as well.
Could fit nicely with the ICANN, as you know, is going through a discussion or an effort to figure out accountability mechanisms in the wake of the NTIA announcement, which is parallel to discussions of oversight of the IANA function. So those two could fit together quite well.
Yes.
The mobile obviously is extremely important, and I heard Vince Cerf speak. I watched Vince Cerf speak at the World Bank last week, where he was talking about how many mobile devices there are. It's just incredible, the growth in it. So talk about radio spectrum issues that may come up at the ITU. What is the U.S. position vis-a-vis encouraging other countries to share licensed or unlicensed spectrum?
The questions relative specifically to how different bands of spectrum are used internationally will come up at the World Radio Conference, which is the following year, in November of the following year. But mobile technologies, because of their price per person ratio, has allowed for a much broader deployment of the network and access to the internet than had been historically possible at a faster rate. So what we're trying to do in that particular space is encourage, one, the completion of the digital transition in the developing world in particular, and in Africa in particular, to ensure that there's more efficient use of spectrum and there's an ability to use 4G networks to distribute services broadly. We're also looking and partnering with people like at Microsoft and Google and others who are using white spaces and unlicensed technologies to deploy in very, very rural areas. We're also working very closely with our colleagues at the regulatory agencies around the world to encourage competition and investment to break up what have been traditionally monopolies of telecommunications around the world, to ensure that there is an appropriate investment in marketing of the services to people around the world. And it's very interesting to see how necessity is the mother of invention, how a mobile phone will be used by someone, say, in an agricultural setting in Africa to ensure that they have a knowledge of prices going to market, or of weather changes coming in, or like there was one case I read about fishermen being at the dock and using their phones to connect to who was in town at the market itself to ensure that they weren't bringing more fish from dock to market than has been done historically. And again, it's this conceptualization of the network as a platform for other things, right? That we need to articulate and really systematically analyze and present to ensure that people around the world don't get the sense that internet governance only matters for how, you know, Facebook's terms of services or how Google search engines direct you to whatever, both of which are extremely important. Both are great American companies, and I'm not degrading any of that, but what I'm saying is that there is a self-interest for the developing world, for the whole world, in ensuring that the network remains open, free, and interconnected.
Working up towards the ITU, are you optimistic about outcomes? Could you tell us what you expect, what you think?
I am. I am very optimistic about it. I think the incentives are in place for a strong plenipotentiary. It's in the interest of the existing Secretary General to leave on a good note. It's in the interest of the incoming Secretary General to start his tenure on a good note. It's in the interest of the Union to prove to the world that we are working in the public interest and will work on a consensus basis, that it is a union. So I think all of those things coming together, as well as just the yeoman's work that the community itself has done externally. I emphasize that, again, and I look around this room and I know that there are a lot of people here who dedicate themselves to the same task outside of the governmental functions that I exercise, that the United States government is simply one component and one actor in the internet community, trying to ensure that the internet community gets what it wants, which is the ability to ensure that expertise is born on the deployment of the network, and that it is as frictionless as possible. And that innovation is, for lack of a better word, permissionless as possible, that you don't have to go to Geneva or any centralized gathering of ministers and ask permission for the design of technologies or the design of services or the deployment thereof, because it would obviously slow down the deployment of the network and hurt innovation.
Let me ask you about one thing about the ITU that's of particular concern to journalists, but it is to everybody, and that is openness of the ITU. In the past, going up to Wicked especially, there were certain documents that were withheld, but they were leaked, obviously. But
we systematically leaked them.
Well, Dr. Ture, the Secretary General, made the point that governments are free to do that.
And this government did.
And so my question is, what are your plans with ITU? Will the tranches of all the countries, will all the working documents that are coming in become transparent quickly?
Yes, I mean, in the first instance, we will make them available. But separately and apart from that, we're working hard to ensure that there are a number of institutional changes at the ITU, including dramatically greater participation, and we've seen it through multi-stakeholder preparatory processes for the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, as well as the World Telecommunications Development Conference, as well as the WSIS Plus 10 review that was coordinated by the ITU, all of which were successful. The challenge that the relatively substantive challenge that is presented is that sector members and members pay to have access to these documents. The ITU is, like all of us, is facing some degree of budgetary constraints. Right. So the question is, where do you make that up and how? But there is, we would argue that there is an outcome value to having documents be open that is greater than whatever monetary resources you're gaining from charging people for access to those documents.
Let's turn to WSIS plus 10 review process, which is coming to ahead next summer. Talk a little bit about what that is, what's coming, what your expectations are.
Sure. The World Summit on the Information Society was constructed in 2 phases in 2003 and 2005 in Geneva and Tunisia, respectively. My former predecessor, David Gross, led the American delegation to that event. And the question there was, how are we going, and the question posed to everyone was, how are we going to create a people-centered information society? And there was a set of resolutions and a set of agenda frameworks going forward, and action lines created. I believe there were 9 or 10 of them, and they were distributed out among the UN bodies. It was determined in Tunis that 10 years later, and here we are, there would be an assessment of how well or not well those action lines had been met, and a review of how to ensure that they were met and completed going forward. So that's what I expect to happen this year. We did that in part through the WSIS plus 10 review process that just occurred in Geneva, and that's been forwarded to New York. The UN CSTD is constructing its own input and assessment process, which it too, and it was tasked to do that for the oversight of the entire UN system, will forward to the UNGA in June of next year. And then at the United Nations General Assembly itself, there will be a gathering of folks like myself to discuss where we stand relative to the action lines that were existing. Now, it was our goal, and we successfully achieved this goal, to avoid the creation of a new summit or the establishment of new action lines. Right? And the reason we did that was largely because the initial promises that the world made to itself under the WSIS have not been completed. And we don't have universal deployment of the network, among other things. And so we need to ensure that we, make real on the promises that we've made before we establish any new promises going forward.
I see. Let me read a little bit from the Tunis agenda, just a couple of paragraphs. This will be very brief. Paragraph 68 and 70 I'll be reading from. We recognize that all governments should have an equal role and responsibility for international internet governance and for ensuring the stability, security, and continuity of the internet. We also recognize the need for the development of public policy by governments in consultation with all stakeholders. That's just paragraph 68. That sounds as if one of the promises of the Tunis agenda is that public policy, large level public policy, not state public policy, I would take it, would be done by governments in consultation with other stakeholders, which sounds to me like other stakeholders are put in a subsidiary position. Is that your reading of that language? Is there a focus on this kind of language as we prepare for the event next summer?
Well, that language and the interpretation that you just presented is often used in argumentation to make the case that you just made. I read it differently, and that's the nature of sort of politically agreed upon documents, is different people read them differently, and that's how you get to yes, right? But the idea that all governments have equal responsibility and should stand on equal footing relative to internet governance, they do. At the end of the day, any government can go to ICANN and sit on the government advisory committee process and has no more power than any other government there. And at the end of the day, that does not mean that because they have equal power to each other, they should have more power than others, right? So at the end of the day, I don't think that there is a contradiction between that statement and the way that we exercise internet governance today. As it relates to the degree to which governments or public policy should be executed relative to the internet in coordination and cooperation with the multi-stakeholder system, with the multi-stakeholders, that is actually how we do that in the United States, right? And how its governments execute these functions around the world. Now, because governments, so for example, we have a Child Online Privacy Protection Act, we have a Universal Service Fund, we have antitrust and competition policy, we have any number of areas of public policy that relate to the operations of communications networks, including the internet. That does not mean that we need an international intergovernmental rule of one size fits all for the world. Nor does it mean that because government should act in coordination with stakeholders that it must always take action. There are multiple situations in which issues are simply not right, that we don't have enough knowledge or really a need to inject ourselves relative to the work that's being done or happening organically within the market. And there are different structures and different competitive situations around the world where people will behave differently, right? But again, we would return to the first principle, which is that this network, or network of networks, which is really about the underlying protocols that enable the connection between networks and the engineering that allows its execution and the cooperation and collaboration among multiple actors, predominantly from the private sector, to ensure that it remains operational and international and interoperable. That there is the success that this community has had in developing the network to the point where now 2.7 billion people have access to it, and it has become the greatest force for individual empowerment since the printing press. That at the end of the day, we as governments should show some humility in the face of that achievement. And I believe that we are doing that. And I believe, again, that I look at everything that's occurred since my tenure has started, and we have not had yet, and knock on wood, we have not gone to the global war yet. Mm-hmm. Where we've had challenges and difficulties, we've been able to work them out with our colleagues.
Let me ask you a little bit. We've been talking about how governments come together at the ITU, at the WSIS 10+10, et cetera. Governments on a national level come together and work at a high level. Let me ask you about the impact on internet governance from government a little bit below that level. Court decisions, which is we rarely hear about. The European Court of Justice recently, as I know you know, came up with a decision that privacy sort of trumps some of the workings of the internet in a sense. And the effect of the decision, often referred to as the right to be forgotten case, is that Google has to de-index search results pointing to an to a story that actually appeared in a publication some years ago because of someone's privacy rights. Does your office have a role in briefing governments as an amicus curiae or in some other form about the impact of decisions like this or briefs like this, arguments like this?
No. At the end of the day, the European Court of Justice is their equivalent of our Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. It makes a decision, that decision is law. They will execute and implement that decision, hopefully in a manner that is easily complied with by not just Google, but whatever the scope is of the decision, and the implementation will determine that. We want to make sure that the efforts to protect an individual's privacy, which is critical, do not come into conflict with other human rights. Access to information is a generally accepted human right. Freedom of expression, access to journalistic freedom, and other critical values that we know Europeans hold dear. And I think, if I understand correctly, and they have not talked to us about it, but that Google and others are in the process of going themselves and working it out with the Europeans in terms of what they do. But this goes back to the idea of choke points in the network, mm-hmm. right? The Europeans take very, 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 very seriously the idea of individual privacy as a human right, even as it relates to the corporate collection, use, and distribution of information. We treat it as a consumer right. These are fundamentally different frameworks to look at privacy through. And at the end of the day, what the ECJ court determined, if implemented in a way that isn't judicious, could result in significantly greater harm than good. But I would caution our colleagues around the world in their efforts to try to identify a specific choke point and then leverage that choke point to achieve some other public policy end. Because once you've accepted that that's a tool for leveraging another public policy end that you like, you also have to accept that that's a tool for leveraging a public policy end that you do not like. And at the end of the day, it is human behavior that you're objecting to, not technology, right? So, and this comes up all the time, right? And we're working through the IGF, in particular, the Internet Governance Forum, mm-hmm. to have discussions about what are the best practices in relationships between individuals and firms, individuals and governments and corporations, to ensure that we have what is a relatively peaceful and cohesive environment of activity on the Internet.
Let me ask you about a case here. It's just an early case, but basically there is a dispute going on between victims of terrorism and the nation of Iran, and ICANN has gotten entangled in the case in the sense that they've received a subpoena. And the subpoena seems to be going at the idea that the country code top-level domain for Iran may be seizable somehow at a lower American court. Obviously, none of that's decided, but a decision along those lines would have an impact in the press. And so my question is, does your office have a role in an amicus brief or in otherwise briefing that court as to the impact of such a decision, should one be considered?
It's possible that we would have a role if we made a decision to inject ourselves into that particular case. You raised this question at the IGF USA,
I did.
And so I looked into it because I hadn't heard about it, and I don't have an answer for you today, but we're still looking at a particular case, and I would also be interested in hearing what the leadership from ICANN has to say about it.
Okay. I'm going to open it to the floor just in a minute. I would like to ask one question, though, to sort of wrap up our conversation, and that is, and we've touched on this a little bit, it seems that the multi-stakeholder process of governance is fragile, in a sense. Sometimes it seems to be hanging by a thread. I don't know.
I mean, that's what people say about the World Trade Organization and any form of international interaction. It's a fragile world.
But let me make the case for those, Russia, China, Iran, you hear nations, that are in favor of more government control. And they will say, yes, you're absolutely right. This is a tremendous engine of innovation, progress, et cetera. But it has brought in its wake what Justice Scalia refers to as the parade of horribles. There's what seems now to be the minor problem of spam, but there's identity theft, there's fraud, the scourge of child pornography. There's basically no privacy left. As Vince Cerf said at the World Bank last week, it's harder and harder to live a private life. There are many things that are bad that have either come in the wake of the internet or have been exacerbated in the wake of the internet. And don't they have a point? And oftentimes they are told, well, these are being worked on, to which they may respond, we've heard that for 20 years. So where does that fall out? Isn't there a fair case to be made on the other side of the multi-stakeholder debate?
No, there isn't. At the end of the day, all of the issues that you raise are issues of human behavior on the network. And many of them are being dealt with in alternative fora. So you take cybercrime, for example, is being dealt with at the Budapest Convention and in bilateral national-to-national relationships. You take issues relative to child online protection or pornography, those issues are being dealt with on a jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction basis. And in the United States in particular, we have multiple child online pornography is illegal. Because you do something on the internet doesn't make it legal. If it's illegal off the internet, it's illegal on the internet. And at the end of the day, prosecuting that is a function of law enforcement. The International Telecommunications Union is a gathering of communications ministers, not intelligence officials, not law enforcement officials, not experts on human rights. There are other forums in which to have those discussions, and many of the challenges, spam, fraud, et cetera, the community itself recognizes and feels that those are challenges and are taking steps to address them. Spam isn't really a problem in the vast majority of the world. If your broadband service internet provider has the tools and technology in place to essentially siphon off or protect you from spam, for example. So, and at the end of the day, it's a disingenuous argument because it's not the end goal. The end goal coming out of authoritarian regimes is to control what people say and do online and to use technology to enable the execution of that authority. That is a non-starter. We object completely. There's no room for negotiation there, right? And at the end of the day, the internet does operate differently in China and in Russia and in Iran than in the rest of the world. The underlying protocols are the same, but the freedom that people have to exercise their individual will is not. We will not allow the internationalization of those practices.
Thank you. I have a question. We have a microphone. So we're going to open it to a question or comment from the floor. Please be somewhat brief.
Hi, my name is Barbara Dello, and I'm not one of the people in the room who know more than you do. But I'm asking my question because I think it's a concern of many American citizens. I had a Facebook, and I used it like a diary, and I kept it very limited to my friends and family. Yet it seemed that everybody was knowing my business. Now, you mentioned the word manage, and you mentioned the word that this technology has the potential to perhaps do things like prevent car accidents. What degree of technological oversight is there of average American citizens? I mean, Is there any danger to me from like other governments because, say, for instance, I'm in contact with German relatives? You know, would a country like Israel or Poland or Russia be interested in that? Can it be politically used to be hypercritical of my work as a nurse? Is there oversight of like nursing homes? You mentioned about potential for parenting. Can there be any oversight of how I raise my children? And I think the people in America are very concerned about privacy and the internet and the technology and the satellites. So my question to you basically is, can there be any monitoring if I haven't allowed someone to monitor me?
Thank you. Why don't we take 2 or 3 questions and then I'll answer them in a whole.
Okay. Right beside you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Donna Wells. I'm an expert in the Russian language internet, how to view a country through the lens of its internet.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
My name is Dr. Donna Wells. I'm an expert in the Russian language internet, how to view a country through the lens of its internet. Is there a sense that popular internet access rates can grow too fast in the developing world? Could rapid growth lead to violence and instability? And I'm not talking about child porn or identity theft. I'm talking about revolution and political unrest. Thank you.
Thank you.
And was there a third question?
Well, I'll just take those 2 then to start. In terms of the questions that you raised about privacy, so what happens when you grant authority as an individual to a private firm, in this case Facebook, to collect, use, and distribute your information? In accordance with what you're saying, which is the distribution to a specific audience, your friends and family, and whether or not there's any governmental authority over those practices. In the first instance, there's contractual authority, right? Facebook has to comply with its terms of service. So if they're doing something or using it in a way that doesn't comport with what you've agreed to, then they're subject to law enforcement. Separately, you're protected by the Federal Trade Commission's protections against unfair or deceptive practices. If they led you to believe that your information was going to be used in one way and then it was used in another way, then they're subject to law. And I'm not positive, but I believe Facebook is actually currently under a consent decree at the FTC on that very subject. The other questions that you raise about the degree to which governments may or may not be interested in your personal activity will differ essentially from government to government, and is really a question for intelligence activities, authorities and operators, and is not specific to the internet. So I would have to defer to their expertise. Relative to the question on what is the destabilizing potential for the deployment of the network in a universal fashion, in a manner in which it could be used for harmful purposes. So could theoretically a terrorist use the network to organize, or even in a country that is in the process of developing a democracy, destabilize the development process of that democracy? The answer to that question is sure, in theory. But by that same token, people who have access to the network can use the network to organize against those functions. So at the end of the day, it is not our role to protect people essentially from themselves, but our commitment to freedom of expression, freedom of safety, freedom of organization, freedom to organize, is because we believe the exercise of those freedoms on balance will result in greater outcomes. So where we've seen these freedoms exercised using the internet has had positive outcomes. And those positive outcomes have been disproportionately relative to economics, but they are also important for the purposes of injecting oneself into the political dialogue and ensuring that incumbent power is challenged, and that you can force them to hear you. And that we believe those are all good things.
Steve, there's a question up front here.
Thank you. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. Ambassador, you were enthusiastic about the Net Mundial and the first principle being multi-stakeholder. So the question leading into ITU Plenipot would be if those same nations who embraced multi-stakeholder for the net have 2 choices at ITU. I guess they could, as a government-only organization, the ITU would have to constrain itself to non-internet issues, since they already agreed that internet issues should be multi-stakeholder. Plan B would be for the ITU to embrace multi-stakeholderism so it could address the internet And that would be a fascinating concept, to have 4 lines at the Planet Pod in Busan and let multi-stakeholders weigh in. But aren't those really the only 2 paths they can take, given that all those nations supported principle number 1 coming out of Net Mundial?
I would agree that that's a correct analysis of the situation.
And how will they go? And how will this be worked out?
We'll have the debate, right? And we'll see where our colleagues land. Look, we're going to, ultimately, all of the Americas, Venezuela wasn't there and Cuba wasn't there, but all of the Venezuelas, all of the Americas was agreed on both the principle and the roadmap. And to the degree to which we stay together as a region, developed and developing countries, democracies alike, committed to the exercise of basic freedoms, we can win that argument at the ITU, and we will. We will win that argument.
And so it's teed up nicely then, because if they want at the ITU to expand their remit to cover the internet, they would have to embrace the multi-stakeholder model.
I would honestly prefer that they didn't, whether or not they embrace the multi-stakeholder model. To the degree that they want to inject their opinion as a united union into multi-stakeholder institutions, there is within the ITU a working group on internet public policy. We are working to expand the operations of that group to make sure that it is fully inclusive of multi-stakeholder participation and shows deference to the outcomes of multi-stakeholder discussions and is based on consensus. But thank you.
Marilyn?
Thank you. My name is Marilyn Cade. Thank you, Ambassador, for your comments. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction than Steve just did. I'm going to take us into building the IGF as a possible, and strengthening the IGF as a possible focal point for U.S. policy activities and for the interactions that you're engaged in with other countries. I was privileged to watch your video interaction with Nigeria multi-stakeholder yesterday with Fiona Alexander, and congratulations on that. I look forward to seeing many more of those. If you haven't seen it, I urge others to watch it. On the IGF, we've seen the IGF move from a concept in 2005 that blossomed because the Greek government put their activity into hosting the first IGF. If they had not done that, this concept could have floundered, but it didn't. And we are now at the 9th IGF in Istanbul. The attendance is doubling. There are actually many more attendees from governments and civil society than from business. So my question is, as you at the State Department and your counterparts in the interagency look at the IGF, are you thinking, and do you have further ideas about how we might all work together to significantly strengthen and evolve the IGF to help address some of these challenges?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Marilyn is one of those people in the room that knows more than I do and has asked a question to which she knows the answer. So Marilyn organized the IGF USA just I don't know if it was this week or last week. I spoke at it, but my schedule is such that I often don't know where I am. So at the end of the day, I do think that the Internet Governance Forum, which creates a space, a non-treaty making space in which the multi-stakeholder community can come together and directly address and work with governments relative to questions that are outstanding and challenges that are outstanding on internet governance issues and internet-related public policy, is the critical underpinning of our alternative solution to international regulation. We have to create a space in which people feel comfortable challenging how the internet operates, how people behave on it, and asking for solutions to what are real problems. Cybersecurity is a real problem. Child online protection is a real problem. Now, these are all real, the distribution of the network and the development of the network to ensure that it reaches poor people. There are 2 billion people in the world that live on less than $2 a day. How are we going to reach those people? How are we going to make sure that the applications are relevant to their lives and useful for them? That's a real challenge. None of those are real challenges that require international regulation, but they do require engagement, they do require cooperation, they do require information sharing, and that is the purpose of the IGF. We, the United States, fully back the IGF. We made a significant financial contribution to it last year. We will be working toward that end as well, though we have nothing to announce at this point. But we strongly support the idea. If we encourage others to participate, it is currently scheduled to take place in Mexico and Brazil in the coming years after Istanbul, which again, having the Global South be as inclusive and participatory of them and their interests and their needs throughout all of the institutions that constitute internet governance will be the key to our success.
Thank you. And then we have really reached the limit, so I would like to thank you for your questions. Ambassador, thanks so much for taking the time.
Appreciate it.
We need just a minute to restage. So if you don't like your seat and want to move, now's the time. Grab some more coffee. There's still breakfast out front. So give us just a couple minutes and we will regroup.
will you be also sitting up here at any point? I think I'm going to stay here. Okay. If you notice anybody...
Can I get my panelists to come back up front here? Thanks. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll get Ambassador Sepulveda, who has very nicely agreed to stay into the panel discussion as well. I feel just tickled that he wants to do that. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the morning to spend talking about internet governance. I'm really excited that I don't actually know you all, because I figured I'd probably walk in a room. Usually, I've been doing this for about 14 years. I know everybody in the room. So if I don't know you, take the time afterwards to please come over and say hello. As we're getting this program underway, we are going to be doing some roundtable discussions. So this is really kind of an entry to the topic area for the American Enterprise Institute. We're also doing a whole program on cybersecurity. Some days they'll kind of cross each other, and other days they'll be done as separate topics. So if you're not currently signed up to want to be on the AEI information list, please do that, and we'll make sure that we get you included. So I feel very fortunate to have this group here, and I really want this to be a dialogue, and so I hope you guys are ready to ask some questions, because I realize quite a few in the room have quite as much to say about what's going on here and have been part of the multi-stakeholder process. If you're not and you want to know more about it, please feel free. There's many people in the room you should be talking to. Marilyn Cade in the back of the room certainly is one of them. There's a lot of people who write on this topic, so I think you'll start to realize that if you don't currently follow some of the people, that they have got a lot to say, and we've got some excellent writers in this space. You have, when you first came in, you've got everybody's bios, so I'm not going to walk through all that. There's a couple other pieces in here. One of them I did, which I'll reiterate when Larry Strickling comes in, is a lot of work has been done in this space on accountability, and Larry always gets really frustrated and says, has anybody read the Accountability and Transparency Review Team, which is, they call it the ATRT. So we did put this on the website. If you haven't taken the time, you might want to take a couple minutes and look. Well, it takes a little longer than that to read, but and see what's going on. So I'm going to let this become a free-flow conversation, but one thing that I is kind of a joke that has continued along with me is I've been to a lot of ICANN meetings, and when I have to explain it to people, I say, well, I can actually do this for you on a cocktail napkin. So what I've done over here in the corner is done my little iteration that I usually do, just a little bit bigger, to explain how the process works. And one of the challenges, which will be just one of the topic points here, so you have the support organizations and the advisory councils at the bottom of the multi-stakeholder process, and then we have working groups, which have become very prevalent in the ICANN space, which build into something called the Generic Name Support Organization, which has many people that are in that process, which eventually the things that are discussed show up at the board level, which I'm sure Steve would have lots to talk about. Then the problem is we have this sort of monolith that's on the side, which is the Government Advisory Committee, and they don't tend to be as engaged in the whole pyramid process. And so one of the things that I'm going to be working on as we kind of go through this program is how do we get the governments more engaged when it's appropriate to get them out of that monolith and into the pyramid. Now, there are times when they really, some of the things they want to discuss don't belong there at all, and Ambassador Sepulveda actually kind of related to this. There's a lot of topics that actually belong at the Internet Governance Forum and belong at the ITU that aren't technical in their nature, which is actually what is the basis of what ICANN does. So I just wanted to put that out there as something to be thinking about as we go through this. So we're going to deal with the elephant in the room first, which is the NTIA announced that they are looking to take the IANA function, which has been at the Department of Commerce since they created the ICANN function and moved the whole domain name addressing system out of the National Science Foundation. And they're looking for people to make comments on what do we do to take this management responsibility forward and feel like the people that are running it are accountable and there's an organizational structure around it. So I'm going to just go ahead and open with that since it's one of those things I know that we're going to discuss, then we can go from there. And I know, Steve, you had some comments you wanted to say about that.
Thank you, Shane. And Shane's done a great job simplifying what I was, as an engineer, I was able to make far more complex. This diagram was on the table as you walked in. I've used it for years to show ICANN as this glowing yellow sun in between all of the pressure points of government, users, and the business groups that work with them. And the tethers between the U.S. government and ICANN are really what are being severed in this case. This is actually the U.S. government's last remaining tether, this IANA contract. It's last remaining tether over ICANN, who would prefer only incremental changes as it moves into a transition to take over those IANA functions. So I think it's incumbent on us to encourage the Commerce Department to insist upon ICANN accountability structures for the future. Now, as Secretary Strickling described last week, and this was at the same conference that Danny forgets that he spoke at last Wednesday at IGF USA, there's now 2 tracks in this transition.
He didn't say he forgot. He said he just wasn't sure what day it was. He remembered.
He didn't know which day it was, but he knew he spoke there. That's right, exactly. And one for, there's 2 tracks that Secretary Strickling described. One is the track for the IANA functions. And again, there's really only 3 customer sets for that. The customers who get a copy of the root of the internet every morning, the customers who look at the protocols for the internet, and they change occasionally, and the customers for IP numbers, like internet service providers. And that track has some accountability in it, but it's really a lowercase a accountability. The other track that was launched, to much of my delight, is a discussion on ICANN's general accountability. And that's capital A accountability once the U.S. government steps away from the contract. And last week, after Ambassador Sepulveda and Larry Strickling spoke, we heard Congressman Greg Walden say that this second track, bless you, should be in place. The second track of ICANN accountability should be in place before the IANA functions are given to ICANN permanently. So I'll just close by saying that aside from the .com Act that came through Walden's committee, which my group doesn't support, Walden and other leaders in Congress sent a letter last month to the General Accounting Office asking them to start right now on answering 5 important questions. And 2 of them are relevant to the discussion that Shane has teed up. Congress noted that the current IANA contract and the affirmation of commitments impose obligations on ICANN, and they asked GAO, what commitments should the U.S. government require before the transition? And how could the U.S. government ensure that the commitments are enforceable after the transition? The other open question that the U.S. Congress asked is, what other risks should NTIA consider? And so it isn't a concern about the current ICANN board and management. It's not a critique or a concern there. It's really about future-proofing ICANN the best we can. And one of those tools will be stress tests, and later in the dialogue I'll have a chance to explore a few of those with you.
Any other comments from the panelists on that topic? Well, and Steve, let me tee something up since you look like you're painfully saying I'll try. One of the things that Steve and I have discussed several times, Steve Crocker, the chairman of ICANN, is the need for more engineers and less lawyers in this discussion. And one of the challenges with the IANA discussion has been it's politicized something that's truly technical in its function. So understanding what the IANA function does is very important, and there's probably nobody who can explain it better to Dr. Crocker than Dr. Crocker, or maybe some IETF engineers who are in Toronto today, not here. So I'm curious to know how we continue to guide that conversation so people don't continue to try to pull it in a direction it doesn't belong, and keep it going the right way.
Thank you, Shane. So there's a number of cross currents here, and my mind is racing at trying to how to tease these apart. Let me start with your diagram, actually. The traditional way of describing the function for ICANN is that we oversee the sort of proper administration of the names and numbers and unique identifiers for the internet. If you look at the org chart that we publish about ourselves, you'll see that the GNSO is one of 3 supporting organizations. The other 2 are related to addresses and country code names, country code top-level domains. So the diagram here represents a kind of a transformation of the standard structure that we have, and it puts an extraordinary amount of emphasis on the GNSO. There's both a misunderstanding and a larger truth built into this one diagram that Shane has put up. From a structural point of view, we treat the generic name supporting organization as parallel and equal to these others. And in fact, from a IANA administration point of view, we have names, which are the top-level names. We have numbers, the IP addresses, and we have the protocol parameters that Steve Del Bianco referred to. But if you look at where the energy goes, if you look at where all of the froth, all of the politics is, then it is certainly true. And in fact, if you follow the old adage of follow the money, it's all wrapped up in the generic names business, in the registries and registrars that are under contract to ICANN. So there is this kind of dual issue of what is the structural relationship versus where is all the action or is all the activity. And I would never draw this diagram the way Shane has drawn it, but it has a kind of the emergent property that if you go to an ICANN meeting or if you follow the dialogues online, it's dominated very much by the generic names business. And furthermore, because most of the activity related to IP addresses takes place in other organizations in so-called the regional internet registries, which develop policies for address allocation, and ICANN, through its IANA function, administers those policies that are derived and developed out in the community. So that's one element of what I wanted to share here. Getting to the IANA function in particular, and let me make a brief attempt at demystifying things. The origins of the IANA function were a very modest, unexceptional clerical function of simply recording decisions that have been made and publishing them in a way that everybody had access to them. John Postel took this on and administered it in a very quiet and effective way for a very long period of time, much longer than anybody might have suggested would be feasible. And eventually, that process became important enough that it was necessary to work out some sort of succession. Compressing an awful lot of history into a very few words, ICANN was created to house that function, the so-called Internet Assigned Names Authority. And that is, I always try to draw the analogy to the county recorder's office, which simply keeps track of who owns each parcel of land in a county. And that is one of the grayest and least interesting public offices in any government, at least it should be. Anytime the county recorder's office makes the news, that's very bad. You don't want any interesting activity there. What you do want is an awful lot of activity in the marketplace, which buildings are being put up and where the money is flowing. But the mechanical job of recording who owns the title to each piece of land should be separate. And in the same sense, the IANA function is that recording function. Now, one of the facts that is simply true about the environment that we're in is that ICANN houses both the IANA function and the policy making and the financial and, to a certain lightweight sense, the oversight of the market in the names marketplace. And it's the confusion from a distance of these two quite separate activities that brings an awful lot of attention and concern about ICANN. Let me just, before I turn off the mic here, say one more thing. At ICANN, we view ourselves as occupying a very, very small and very limited space, a position within the Internet governance space, and that from the perspective of Internet governance overall, we expect to see, we need to see, and we're working to help create other mechanisms, other venues, other forums for Internet governance activities. The Internet Governance Forum itself is extremely important, and we're looking to bolster that with the creation of one or more alliances of organizations and people, including governments, that are focused on the broad range of other governance issues outside of the fairly narrow set that ICANN is responsible for.
Steve, I'm happy to be corrected. Anybody else have some ideas, and let me know. I obviously didn't do it to scale. But so you did bring up two really interesting points, which is the CCNSO, which is the other country codes, some of which have chosen to follow the ICANN rules because a lot of them said, look, you've kind of got a plan here. Let's stick with that until we get to a point where we may have to separate for a sovereign reason. And then the addressing, which also shares that space with the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Internet Architecture Board and others. So that actually is a really good jump-off point to remind people that Internet governance goes way beyond ICANN. It's just one of several forums that we're working on. I was very excited several years ago when I was contacted by Laura DeNardis to tell me that she was writing a book. And she's actually teaching about this at my alma mater, American University, because one of my biggest challenges when I used to go to the Hill and talk about this topic was all the telecom lawyers who wanted to tell me how they just wanted to jam this into telecom rules. And this whole area, as Ambassador Sepulveda really demonstrated this morning, it cuts across so many different places because of what it does and the different rules that guide it and the rules that aren't there to guide it. So, Laura, can you tell us a little bit about the advent of what got you into the space and what your book's about?
Absolutely. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here today and be here with all my colleagues and some familiar faces. I was motivated to write this book because I truly believe that economic liberty and expressive liberty are dependent upon a universal and open internet and a secure internet. If you think about the growth of it, 3 billion people are now on the internet. This will soon grow to 5 billion. It's very easy to make an assumption from those growth numbers and the spread of economic development around the internet that this growth will continue, that the economic development will continue. But and I wrote this both from a standpoint of an information engineer and also a social scientist to uncover the nature of this, that we can't take that for granted, that internet governance is always in flux. None of it is a given. So I did recently write a book called The Global War for Internet Governance. I realize that that's a provocative title. one of my friends told me to use either a reference to food, sex, or violence in the title. And I thought it was safest to go with violence. But in all seriousness, I did select a provocative title because I believe that the debates over the future of internet governance are spaces in which power around the economy and around political rights is unfolding in the world. So they're completely entangled with national security, with civil liberties like privacy and freedom of expression, connected to global innovation policy. But several controversies have brought internet governance into the public realm in a way that has never happened before. So while I was writing this book, I was very intrigued. We had WikiLeaks. We had former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton give a speech at the Newseum called the Internet Freedom Speech, which called upon private companies to push back against government requests for censorship and surveillance. And then fast forward 3 years later, we had the expansive disclosures about NSA surveillance practices. We had boycotts, internet boycotts over legislation in the United States. We've had a lot of things happen internationally. The Egyptian internet outage. We have systems of filtering and blocking throughout the world. So all of these things have been unraveling, in the process. I've been studying internet governance for decades, actually. But all of these things have happened to bring this into the public sphere in a greater way. So I wanted to make a few points about that. One point is that internet governance is not about governments. It takes place, it's true that national governments set policies and laws, and that intergovernmental organizations have treaties, so that is a fact. But much of it is done by the private sector, by the companies that run the infrastructure, that run the information intermediaries like search engines and social media, and by the design of technical standards and protocols. So I just want to heap on to what Dr. Crocker and others have said, that it's not just about ICANN. There's a much more massive ecosystem. It's not a unified thing. The ambassador said this morning as well. So you don't just have the control of critical internet resources. You have other areas like standard setting, the policy role of information intermediaries, cybersecurity governance, intellectual property rights protection. This is all part of the broader internet governance ecosystem. So what I tried to do in my book is to lay out the various levers of power over the internet and to highlight some of the open global debates and what's at stake for the future of freedom, both economic and communicative. So I tried to bring that to a more broad audience, and very happy that there are discussions like this taking place as well. Thank you.
Great. Former Ambassador Gross, thank you for getting the IGF party started. Just saying, I think it's going well. I wanted to sort of go back to the idea of what made that something that we needed to have, and do you think that it's been progressing well, and is it a good venue to take the dialogue away from areas it doesn't belong in, like technical coordinating bodies or governance structure?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you to AEI for this. Actually, if I may, before answering your provocative question about IGF, one of the things, looking out here at how many people are very knowledgeable about this, has often been mentioned already this morning. One of the challenges is to come up with something that you all don't already know. And I've come up with only one thing, which is you probably don't know it's Laura's birthday today. So I think we should all wish her a happy birthday. It says something about all of us that we, and particularly Laura, that we spend her birthday together discussing internet governance. And I think, as Laura pointed out about her book, I recommend for those of you not to wait for the movie version, but go ahead and buy it because although the movie I'm sure is in pre-production already, nevertheless, it's a very, very timely and important book. On the IGF, it was one of those things that I think is very instructive to recognize the role of IGF as sort of a way in which you can understand the evolving nature of the entire internet governance debate. It began, as has often been noted, as part of the agreement in 2005 in Tunisia as part of the second phase of WSIS, where there was a sense that it was important to continue to discuss the issues of internet governance, that it should not end at that meeting. but there was a lot of concern about having a continuing series of WSIS debates by governments and by others and continuing negotiations. So the recognition of both the importance of the issues, but the firm view that we shouldn't continue to have debates that result in outcome documents resulted in the creation of the Internet Governance Forum. I would note last week's IGF USA, which I think had about 500 participants, at least about 500 people, was about the size of the first IGF Global, which was held in Athens, which was about 600 or so, and now it has exploded in size. It was a challenge. That first IGF was very important because it was not clear to many whether or not it would be a continuation of the negotiations. And in fact, during the very first plenary panel that I had the honor of participating in, there was, in fact, that issue raised about whether or not this was basically a continuation. And true to the WSIS outcome documents, where it would be a non-decision-making forum, it was decided and recognized that, in fact, it would be a safe space for discussion, for sharing, for focusing on the issues of the day, which at the time included things such as access and the like, and it has evolved from then. I think it is something to be preserved. Clearly, the marketplace has shown, at least to date, that it is an important place for those discussions because it continues to grow. The participation continues to expand in terms of who shows up, governments, civil society, companies, private sector, and academics and others. And so I think it's been very important. I think also one other thing is important associated with the IGF, which is that, at least for me, the takeaway is that the focus of all of these discussions, particularly at the IGF, is about an overarching policy goal. And that overarching policy goal is how to promote continued innovation, access, applications throughout the Internet ecosystem. How to do that is not an easy thing. There are lots of roles by lots of players, but the IGF, I think, has shown tremendous leadership through the MAG and otherwise of identifying topics, players, and discussion, and opportunity to have discussion about that critical set of issues associated with innovation and the continuing evolution of it.
Great. Ambassador Sepulveda, since we have all this going on at IGF, you were our representative at Net, or one of the U.S. representatives at NetMundial. Do you think that there's still just a need for a different dialogue other than what we're having at IGF and ICANN? I mean, is that a one-off, or are we going to continue to have forums like that for foreign governments to feel like they're being heard about the Internet?
Thank you, Shane. I think as Mr. Crocker, Dr. Crocker explained, that there is a move to construct alliances to ensure that the principles and roadmap that were decided at NetMundial are given life. And the IGF can be one of those mechanisms, but it need not be the only one. And to some degree, there are some questions around how you operationalize solutions that are presented at the IGF, or how you find other forms in which to provide solutions at a local or regional level to specific challenges. So in short, I'm not sure that there's the need for something other than the IGF. We are committed to ensuring that the IGF is strengthened and committed to by the world, and that's something that we're going to take to the UNGA next year. But outside of that, we are also supportive of the efforts by the leadership that came out of NetMundial to continue working together towards a cohesive and international mechanism for the support of the multi-stakeholder system that exists outside of ICANN.
Great, thanks. Steve? Sorry.
There's a theme
you
that
wanted
heard
to.
from
You did too, by the way.
Ambassador Gross and Ambassador Sepulveda, the theme that you take a challenge and turn it into an opportunity. The Tempest in Tunis in 2005, you turned into an Internet Governance Forum, and that's been productive, as you said. Ambassador Sepulveda talked about, the Snowden revelations and everything else that's happened, and channeled a lot of that energy into NetMundial, which I think you declared, and most would agree, was pretty successful. And I think we should do the same thing here. We have an opportunity, it's called the transition, the final letting go of the tether, and that is an opportunity for us to really create some accountability that will last for ICANN. And to that end, let me just give you 3 or 4 examples of things like stress tests that we testified to in Congress. Now, say a future ICANN, let's say, canceled its affirmation of commitments, and that's the only obligation ICANN has today to conduct reviews and implement the recommendations from those multi-stakeholder reviews. But the affirmation's cancelable by either party with 120 days notice. So ICANN, future ICANN, could just walk away from that. So we would take a look at how do you guard against that? How do we make sure that that can't happen? A second one would be, let's suppose a future ICANN eliminated its legal and physical presence in the U.S. What would be the implications of that? And is that a stress test we want to guard against? It's fine for ICANN to have physical presence in virtually every other place on the planet, but the question is, could they sever legal presence in the U.S.? And if so, what would we do? A third might be, let's suppose ICANN were to become insolvent, either due to lawsuits or financial mismanagement. How would we pick up the pieces? And then one more would be, let's suppose ICANN expanded its scope beyond the limited technical mission that we are all attributing to it. Maybe it would raise domain name fees in order to fund lots of worthy causes that are pleasing to some governments and some other stakeholders. Is that something we would want to build a stress test around to guard against it? And it may well be, how do you create an accountability mechanism that guards against stress tests? It's going to take some time, so let's get busy on it. And we may well start with high-level principles we might all agree with, principles on limited scope, principles on positioning the community of global internet users and registrants as the ones to whom ICANN is ultimately accountable. We would try to create protections against government capture. It's an important one. And then net mundial outcome. Number 5 on the list of principles coming out of there was redress. It said that, quote, mechanisms for independent checks and balances, as well as for review and redress, should exist. So picking up on that in a system of checks and balances, redress is done through an independent judiciary. So that suggests let's explore an independent, strong review process that could question and challenge ICANN decisions. And while we're on checks and balances, maybe another branch of ICANN that addresses Secretary Strickland's concern. It's not external to ICANN, but within ICANN. And the business constituency that I'm part of surfaced an idea for a permanent cross-community council on accountability. We can talk more about that later if it's something the panelists want to take.
Comments on that note?
I can't resist. I've got a shopping list here of things that we're going to do. We're going to give up the affirmation of commitments. We're going to leave the U.S. We're going to expand our scope, and we're going to raise our fees. I like it.
So you have many places you can choose from: Singapore, Geneva, and Turkey, where there's already offices.
The mind wanders. We can go lots of places.
But I think Steve brings up an interesting point that there's a lot that is asked of ICANN, which is why I think some of these other putting some of these into a different dialogue is part of the challenge, because it's become a forum where a lot of these things take place. So going back to my now augmented chart over there, when we're dealing with the government advisory committee, how do, and I know that you've been doing some bilaterals when you attend, is it possible to take some of these discussions that really don't belong in the technical coordinating body and move them into a better forum? And the one I guess that for me that comes up is .wine, which is a trade issue, and I know that a lot of the people in the room have spent 7 years working on the new TLD program, and I feel like that this is also, and I can't remember Peter Dengate's used to this great term he'd always use, like our best current thinking, that a lot of what we've done with ICANN has been best current thinking throughout the process, because we have been sort of making it up as we go along and sanity checking it as we go along. So there's certainly room for improvement, but there's certainly room to understand when things need to be changed or augmented. I guess that was a comment, not a question.
I can take the bait, I guess. So I don't want to comment too specifically on .wine or any other particular thing, but very broadly, when it's the nature of the internet, not just the domain name system, but it's the nature of the internet that it's changing the landscape of the world. So you have new slogans. The world is flat, for example. If I take Peter Dengate's Thrush's term of best current thinking and stand back considerably and look at a sort of broad arc of history, the Treaty of Westphalia was best current thinking once upon a time. And it's an approximation. It stood up pretty well. We have sovereign countries and so forth, but it is necessarily, if one looks at it kind of absolute scientific terms, just an approximation for how to organize things so that we all get along with each other. Technological change necessarily tests the boundaries of the organizational assumptions, political assumptions that we made, and we're caught up in the middle of all of that in a mostly positive but not necessarily uniform process. And so bringing that back down to very specific and narrow things like .wine, you have, as you said, Shane, fundamentally a trade issue that is also intermixed with political issues and the role of governments versus others in these things. We do our best. We sort this out. We set forth the best rules that we can. We ask everybody to play by those rules, and then we sort of see how that comes out. Will everybody be happy with the outcome? Of course not. As with any kind of governance structure, the most important thing is a belief that that governance structure serves pretty well and is the best thing going. Otherwise, everybody walks away and the whole thing dissolves. So that's, in some sense, where we are. I'm extremely confident that we have a pretty strong structure, and even if some people or some institutions are unhappy about specific results, we're in far better shape than if we didn't have what we have now.
Follow-up thoughts on that?
Let me just comment that the challenge that I think we all collectively face, and the one that Assistant Secretary Strickland, who just arrived, to really set for the entire Internet community as part of this transition, includes the important piece that in the future that this relationship not be captured or recaptured by governments or intergovernmental organizations. I think the challenge that that the community faces has become greater, not less, over the past few months. We saw in London at ICANN 50 a statement by the French minister concerned about the very issues that Steve was identifying, and her call, as unclear to me, but nevertheless a clear call to some, I guess, for an increased role by governments and perhaps a reorganization of the way in which this process would work, perhaps born of frustration over some of these GTLE discussions. We have the recent very lengthy report by the French Senate, at least an aspect of the French Senate, calling for similar things. We see some NGOs calling, particularly during the recent meeting of the BRICS, calling for perhaps a fundamental reshaping of the role of governments and the like. I mention these things really just to indicate the challenge that the community faces, not that the outcome. One of the things which I think all of us have learned over the years is that these things not only are constantly changing, but are greatly influenced by geopolitical events globally. We don't live in the internet world in an isolated world apart from these global tides, whether it's trade issues, whether it's the issues that we see facing the Middle East currently, facing the world community writ large. They almost always come home, whether it's at major international events like the plenipotentiary that Ambassador Sepulveda discussed earlier this morning, whether it's at ICANN-related issues with the GAC. We have to understand this as part of a general discussion. We see, in my view, a shift, a rising tide of call for regulation in the area generally, certainly by many governments and many other institutions. The challenges, as Ambassador Sepulveda talked and touched on earlier today, is to make sure, it seems to me, that our views of the importance of innovation, the importance of the multi-stakeholder approach, continue to be heard globally, recognized globally, and accepted globally. That's not going to be an easy thing going forward.
Other comments? Steve?
Frustration that you spoke of on the part of the French with respect to their wine national champion industry led to a temptation to try to solve it at ICANN. And I think ICANN's done a great job so far of trying to resist that. But it takes other governments who understand that that trade issue doesn't belong in ICANN. They've got to push back on their French colleagues too. There are other temptations. There's regimes that don't like free expression that undermines their national government. The government of Turkey can block access to all of YouTube.com and within its borders when it's unhappy about one or two videos that are there. And that pressure typically leads to takedown of the videos. And Turkey's going to do that no matter who's in charge of ICANN. But the new top-level domain really gets to this power that Ambassador Sepulveda mentioned in his opening remarks. Because it's one thing for Turkey to choke off YouTube.com, but if Turkey can convince enough other governments to agree, then maybe the .YouTube domain, the whole top-level domain, ends up being threatened with a takedown if it doesn't comport with the wishes of a majority of governments. And those are some other stress tests we have to be sure to guard against, because frustration will find an outlet. When governments are frustrated, they'll usually find a way to exert their pressure on whatever institutions and bodies they have any degree of power in. And all it takes is to find enough allies to win a vote, as we saw at Dubai. In the case of ICANN, the GAC, Government Advisory Committee, currently operates on a consensus model, but they alone determine what constitutes a consensus. They can change their own procedures such that a consensus is a simple majority. And at the Singapore meeting, only 60 governments showed up, implying that, well, if 30 governments agreed with Turkey, they could end up giving us advice that we would find almost impossible to follow.
Laura?
I think it's important to acknowledge that arrangements of technology are always also arrangements of power. And there's a temptation to say that we can separate the policy function from the technical function. And to some extent, there are some areas where you can do that. But in many areas, you just can't. And acknowledging that is important. But because of that fact, there is a temptation around the world to interject more government intervention. And this is, the worst case scenario for the future of the internet, because there's a long history here. The technology evolved over a long period of time. In fact, Steve Crocker wrote RFC1, if I'm not mistaken, a long time ago. There's a huge history here. And we're talking about a system that resolves, billions of websites of domain names into numbers per day, hundreds of billions. So, the stability is very important. We see all of these, just to augment what has already been said, we see these proposals around the world for government interventions such as data localization, such as efforts to route around internet exchange points in the United States, for regional specific cloud computing, for policies such as the right to be forgotten in the European Union. And that privacy is very important, but one person's privacy is another person's censorship. So these are the kinds of government interventions that are happening. Now, on the ICANN front, there is a relative balance of powers where private stakeholders are involved. There's civil society involvement. You could argue that there should be more civil society involvement, and then government involvement in the Governmental Advisory Committee. So the one problem that could occur in the proposals is to create yet another institution, and then we'll be having the same discussion about that institution, and you fall into an infinite regress of who is accountable to the next institution. So I think working with the balance of powers and making sure that no one sector, no one stakeholder has more power than the others is the solution.
The only one, Danny. Any thoughts? Final on that? Good. Just came across my Twitter feed that Prince Harry hates Twitter. Just thought I'd share that. He didn't try to turn it off. Apparently, .uk is still safe. They can keep it going. I'm going to open it up to the audience. Questions from the audience? Got one in the very back here, Katie. In the back, in the pink peach.
Hi, Katie McAuliffe, Americans for Tax Reform, Digital Liberty. I wanted to kind of go back to the .wine issue, and I'm wondering why is that such a big deal when .sucks managed to get through? I view this ability as extortionist, and we've talked a lot about what happens when we have this extra governmental structure, and Steve's asked a lot of the really tough questions, but just to get right to the point, in my opinion, .sucks is extortionist, and ICANN can become an extortionist organization. So what do we do about that?
Anyone? Anyone? Could also be considered freedom of speech, just saying. No, okay. All right, we got another question over here in the front. And then, I'm sorry, Phil, got you next.
There you go. Hi. Curious Dr. Crocker wasn't on the list. I have a bunch of points. I'm going to just read through them. Open and secure, my name's Carrie Devra, Center for Copyright Integrity. Open and secure internet is like saying apples and Volkswagens are the same thing. Addressing security, ICANN is open source. You have global multi-stakeholders. There's no 100% disclosure on your site as to who any of these parties are, and you are dealing with Americans' private information. ICANN began with a hack back in the late 1990s with John Postel, and about a month ago, after Fadi testified to Congress there would be no hacking, it was hacked. Shinkuro is your private company. How is Shinkuro going to profit from IANA moving out to ICANN? And also, where is OneNet listed as a nonprofit?
I'm not sure I heard each and every one of your points, so I'll answer the ones that I heard clearly. I do have a little company called Shinkuro. It's not profiting at all from my involvement with ICANN. We file very extensive disclosures of our business interests and conflicts of interest. They're reviewed very aggressively by both council and by a subcommittee, ethics subcommittee within the board. For the record, I've had, and all of this is published, I've had government contracts, U.S. government contracts, which have come to an end, and I'm sort of unprofiting, if you will, from my involvement with ICANN rather than the other way around. And the transition that's anticipated is a non-event from a financial perspective for everybody, not just for me, but for ICANN and for everybody else.
Sure, just as a quick follow-up, if there's an issue between a person and ICANN, where is it going to be resolved? Is it going to be forced arbitration? America is that everybody is entitled to their day in court.
I'm not sure what class of issues we're talking about, but there's an extensive set of both accountability and recourse mechanisms built into ICANN, UDRP, ombudsman, a whole series of things, including, in the end, people do file lawsuits against ICANN, and there's an extensive litigation history.
All right, moving over here, I've got a question from Phil Corwin.
Good morning, Philip Corwin. I'd like to explore just a bit the relationship between ICANN and the GAC and whether there's any lessons to be learned from what's going on with the new TLD program, because we know that support of governments for ICANN and the multi-stakeholder model is an important thing to try to maximize. Real quickly, in the TLD program, let me give 3 quick examples. One, ICANN arguably didn't accommodate the GAC enough. The GAC in Beijing came up, requested safeguards for so-called Category 1 top-level domains that implicate regulated industries and professions. 15 months later in London, the GAC still feels they haven't gotten a good response on that, and the last thing ICANN did was even subject to some criticism from the NTIA, one aspect. The second is ICANN, there was no GAC consensus. Some nations within the GAC wanted protections for geographic indicators like Champagne. The GAC couldn't reach consensus. The GAC chairperson told ICANN we can't reach consensus, yet now there's a controversy about it. Third is one where ICANN argued we should have told the GAC to go away, where on the issue of protections for international organizations at the top and second level, the GNSO Council came out with a unanimous position. The GAC has a position that's almost totally opposite, and instead of backing the stakeholders in the GNSO, ICANN staff have just called for another working group that I'm going to be on, which will kick this can down the road another year or two. I'm not sure it can be resolved. Is there anything to be learned from those 3 examples, or is it just inevitable that ICANN is going to be damned if it doesn't? we're damned if it doesn't, no matter what happens because of the bigger politics of some of these things.
Well, like I said, we certainly don't achieve perfection, and there's always somebody who can arrange to be unhappy. I don't want to get too far into the details of any of the specifics for multiple reasons. This isn't the right forum, and even more importantly, I'm not the right person to try to take you through a complete picture of all of that. But I will say, for the benefit of everybody here, the basic arrangement that's in place is that we listen very carefully to what the GAC says. The GAC is this governmental advisory committee, and when they give us advice that they have reached consensus on, we give that high priority. High priority means, in practice, that the burden is on us at the board level to explain why we're not going to accept it if that's in fact what we do, or to what more commonly is the case, that we would accept the advice. It is also, as you pointed out, not unknown for there to be a very controversial issue within the GAC that the GAC does not reach consensus on, and there the real heartburn, if you will, is that some parties within the GAC are unhappy because they haven't been able to prevail within the GAC. Never mind that and because of that, they haven't been able to get the GAC to give consensus advice, which has a strong presumption that it would be followed as opposed to essentially a non-statement. So that's just real life. That's just, I mean, you don't have to have ICANN or anything in the global environment. You can walk down the street, Pennsylvania Avenue, and you can see the same sort of stuff going on every day.
Thank you. My name is Andrea Glorioso, and I will use a bit of time just to introduce myself. I have been recently appointed as the new counselor in the Embassy of the European Union dealing with internet and ICT policy, so I'm looking forward for working with all of you in the coming years. I'm going to stay here 4 years in this beautiful city. I wanted to make a couple of observations and, of course, listen to the reactions of the panel or other colleagues here. The first, as Dr. Crocker has underlined several times, and I think it's very important to keep in mind, the GAC, the Governmental Advisory Committee of ICANN, in which I was the representative of the European Union for some time, is an advisory body. And ultimately, the final decisions within ICANN are taken by the ICANN board. In a debate about the role of governments versus the role of the private sector, NGOs, I think this point is very important to keep in mind. And the second point concerning the GAC, I was in Beijing. I was part of the team of the European Union that dealt with advice given by the GAC in Beijing. It's important, again, that people realize that of the, Steve, remind me, I think there were more than 2,000 new GTLD applications, a lot of them. The GAC actually expressed an advice clearly saying, we disagree with approving these GTLDs only in 10 cases, 10 out of 2,000. In all the other cases, what the GAC said is, please go ahead, but there are a number of GTLDs, for example, in highly regulated sectors, such as .bank, etc., in which we would like to see safeguards. I think that was a very reasonable approach, and certainly not one that I would qualify as governmental hyper-intervention or anything like that. More broadly, and I thank Professor Denardis for reminding all of us that ICANN is part of the broader internet governance ecosystem, something that people forget sometimes, including the European Union, by the way, is that in this debate, it's very important to keep in mind that certain states, certain governments, certain public administration take positions not because they're evil, not because they are against the US, if you allow me to be very blunt about it, but because they have a history, they have a culture, they have their economic interests, they have a duty to protect their own citizens and apply their own laws. Now, this doesn't mean that those positions have to prevail no matter what, because this is a dialogue. But in this debate, and I've been dealing with internet governance matters for the best part of 15 years, too long probably, I feel that sometimes understanding the reasons of the counterpart is not given enough attention. And this is something, as we proceed in the discussion of the IANA transition, ICANN accountability, and the future of the internet, we should really, in my humble opinion, keep in mind. And last but not least, I would like just to get back to one point that Ambassador Sepulveda gave during his introductory remarks. I think, Ambassador, that you said that multi-stakeholderism is a form of participatory democracy. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. But then the question is, are we creating enough links between the communities that have been working on participatory democracy outside of the internet sphere? And there is a very, very long history of work in that from academia, from civil society, in many different fields, and the internet governance ecosystem. Because I can tell you, again, having been dealing with internet governance for quite some time, I sometimes feel that this world is not talking enough to the rest of the world outside. It's a kind of a self-centered community, and this can become a problem at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Shane, would it be all right to respond to Andrea?
Absolutely.
Thank you for the question, Andrea. And I know it sounds reasonable to require ICANN to police these regulated professions, .accountant and .lawyer, and require that those new top-level domains ensure that any applicant simultaneously conform and be certified in the laws of every country. But as a practical matter, it's nearly impossible because, as you say, every country regulates accountants and lawyers differently. And what seems and sounds reasonable ends up being pretty unworkable. For instance, should Jeff be allowed to get Eisenach.economist as his domain name? Well, don't answer that. I don't want Jeff to be put on the spot. But it brings to light the fact that it's almost impossible to preserve the openness and freedom of opportunity on the internet. It's not just freedom of expression, it's freedom of opportunity and innovation. We can't preserve that if we simultaneously require that the laws of every single jurisdiction on the planet have to be incorporated before somebody buys a label for a domain name. Governments can't expect to use the labeling system to police all their independent laws. I think that is an unreasonable aspect of what you said sounded like a reasonable request.
Other thoughts? And I apologize, we're at 11 o'clock, so Dan, you can have the last word.
I just want to quickly respond to that. In the first instance, I completely agree that we have to make these processes as inclusive as possible, and that there's an expertise to be brought to bear on the processes themselves that requires additional outreach to new actors. That said, the process is not structurally exclusive. Anyone can participate in these processes. There is a mutual responsibility between the internet governance community in reaching out and including not just the kind of experts you're talking about, but stakeholders from the developing world and other parts of the world who feel like they aren't being heard as well as they should be. But there's a mutual responsibility on the other side to participate. So at the end of the day, we have to balance those responsibilities and create the right incentives for participation. And setting aside any specific area of conflict, it's not the outcome that is the question, but the process. Is the process fair? So as we've worked with our colleagues in France who are concerned with these issues and bring an extreme amount of passion to the conversation, what we're trying to assess is where is the process problem that they have. We understand the outcome problem that they have. And we have asserted a separate understanding of why the outcome is appropriate given the circumstances, and that this is an issue that should be handled in other, and we have been negotiating and managing in other forums, the WTO and WIPO in particular. But the arguments that our colleagues have made from Europe are relative to how the process was put into place. And we're in the process of assessing that through the accountability review and transparency process, the third one at ICANN, to ensure that all participants feel like they are being heard and that they have rights and responsibilities, and that both are managed properly within the system.
Can you please join me in thanking the panelists? Our final speaker for the day has arrived. So, there is more coffee in the back if anybody wants to grab some coffee. But I really want to give kudos to Assistant Secretary Strickling. I've worked with many of the NTIA assistant secretaries who have had this in their portfolio, and I don't know anyone who's spent more time or energy on the issue of ICANN, internet governance, and the issues around that. Larry, just to let you know, I mentioned earlier, and it is on our website, it's on the ICANN website, it's on the NTIA website, the link to the Accountability and Transparency Review Team. So there's been a lot of work done in this space. For a lot of people, this is the first time that it has come to their cognizance, but it's available, and sorry, a lot of movement around here. we look forward to having you come in and talk to us about this and let us know what we can do to be helpful in the future. So please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Larry Strickling. Housekeeping. No, I think they're probably
So I'm not sure what to do here. Shane says plow ahead, even though a lot of folks have left the room. So we'll let them catch up later on. But thank you, Shane. And I do want to thank the American Enterprise Institute and Shane and Jeff Eisenack for inviting me to address this group today on the important issue of internet governance. And in particular, today, I want to focus on what has been happening over the last few months in response to NTIA's announcement in March that we intend to transition our stewardship role with respect to the Internet Domain Name System. So at the outset, I want to put your minds at ease. Contrary to some initial concerns that we were giving away the Internet, the response from the global Internet community has been overwhelmingly supportive. The community has organized a multi-stakeholder process to determine what will happen once the United States steps out of its current limited role. And the discussions to date demonstrate that the community is taking this transition very seriously and is determined to develop a transition plan that will ensure that the Internet Domain Name System continues to support a growing and innovative Internet. However, before I get into the details, let me start by setting the stage. Specifically, let me answer the questions: what is NTIA's role today with respect to the domain name system, and what are we proposing to change? So this transition is the last step in a privatization process that started 16 years ago when the U.S. government committed to allowing the private sector to take leadership for domain name system management. In 1998, the Department of Commerce designated the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which we all know as ICANN, to perform what are known as the IANA functions. And these functions include assigning Internet Protocol or IP numbers to registries who then assign them to Internet service providers. Another function is the maintenance and updating of the root zone file for top-level domain names, the so-called address book for the Internet that's necessary for the routing of Internet communications. So in March, we asked ICANN to convene global stakeholders to develop a proposal to transition the current role played by my agency, NTIA, in the coordination of the domain name system. Now, our role is largely procedural in that we verify that ICANN followed its policies and procedures in processing domain name change requests. Then we pass that request on to VeriSign, which implements the changes in the root zone file itself. So we have no operational role. We don't initiate changes to the root zone file or to the assignment of IP numbers or to the allocation of Internet numbering resources. Now, in making our announcement, we communicated a number of conditions that must apply to the transition. First, the proposal must support and enhance the multi-stakeholder model of Internet governance, in that it should be developed by the multi-stakeholder community and have broad community support. And more specifically, we stated that we will not accept a transition proposal that replaces the NTIA role with a government-led or intergovernmental organization solution. Second, the proposal must maintain the security, stability, and resiliency of the domain name system. Third, it must meet the needs and expectations of the global customers and partners of the IANA services. And finally, it must maintain the openness of the Internet. Now, our announcement does not change anything about how the domain name system operates today. Before any transition takes place, the businesses, civil society, and technical experts of the global internet community must present a consensus plan that ensures the uninterrupted and stable functioning of the internet and its present openness. We have not set a deadline for this action. While the current contract with ICANN expires in September 2015, we have repeatedly noted that we can extend the contract for up to 4 years if the internet community needs more time to develop a proposal that meets the criteria we have outlined. And in the meantime, our current role will not change. Since our announcement, ICANN, working with other internet organizations such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, the Internet Architecture Board, the Internet Society, and the regional internet registries, has laid out a process for developing the plan based on consultations with stakeholders which began in Singapore in March. Acting as a facilitator, ICANN earlier this month announced the formation of a coordination group of around 30 individuals representing 13 different internet communities that will help develop a transition proposal. This group held its first meeting last week in London, and the group appears to be off to a good start. It has developed a proposed charter for comment that affirms that it will conduct itself transparently, consult with a broad range of stakeholders, and ensure that its proposals support the security and stability of the IANA functions. I am confident that by working out these important issues, this process will strengthen the multi-stakeholder process and will result in ICANN's becoming even more directly accountable to the customers of the IANA functions and to the broader internet community. Also this spring, in response to community discussions at its Singapore meeting, ICANN announced a separate process to address ways to improve its overall accountability. Specifically, this process will examine how ICANN can strengthen its accountability mechanisms to address the absence of its historical contractual relationship with NTIA. This important accountability issue will and should be addressed before any transition takes place. Now, we will monitor progress of both of these work efforts closely and carefully. We remain steadfast in our commitment to preserve and protect the vibrant, free-flowing internet, and we will ensure that the plan submitted to us from the community satisfies our conditions and has been stress-tested, that's Steve DelBianco's favorite term, to ensure that it can deal with whatever contingencies arise in the future. Now, as anyone paying attention to internet governance issues knows, our announcement created a lot of discussion and a little bit of controversy. But overall, the international community has applauded the move as it demonstrates in a concrete way the commitment of the United States to the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. But here in the United States, some have argued, hey, if it's not broke, why fix it? But let me explain why this is the right move at the right time. First, as ICANN has performed the IANA functions over the years, it has matured as an organization and has taken important steps to improve its accountability and transparency, as well as its technical competence. Second, as witnessed so strongly in the past several months, international support has continued to grow for the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. And as a result, many of the internet's key stakeholders, including internet firms like Google, communications providers like AT&T and Cisco, and civil society groups such as Human Rights Watch and Public Knowledge, support this transition as the right course at the right time. Now, I understand that these issues are complex and that any change, even one as planned and as evolutionary as this one, raises questions that need to be answered. And we welcome a full and open debate on the transition, but at the same time, we should base that discussion on facts, not on myths or ideologies. For example, there is a persistent notion that the United States currently controls the internet, and that is simply not true. The internet has been and will continue to be a decentralized network of networks that relies on cooperation and coordination of many stakeholders for its efficient operation. It works today, and it will work after the transition because the stakeholders are committed to making it work, not because of the IANA contract between the United States and ICANN. Now, some critics have argued that NTIA is proposing to give away United States property as if we were proposing that the United States give Alaska back to Russia. Now, we do not own the domain name system, and we cannot give away what we do not own. Instead, our contract with ICANN simply designates it to perform the IANA functions. Neither ICANN nor the United States pays anything to each other under this contract. And now that ICANN has demonstrated its ability to perform these functions with the support of the community, there is no longer a need for the United States to designate ICANN to perform these functions, and we're just simply not obligated to maintain a contract when it is no longer needed. Another misconception about the transition is that our announcement has emboldened authoritarian governments like Russia to attempt to exert greater influence over internet policy. Our announcement arguably has had the opposite effect of reducing Russia's influence in the rest of the world for greater governmental control over the internet. It is a historical fact that Russia has long argued for more governmental control of the internet. This is nothing new. It is simply not the case that Russia started to argue for greater governmental control only after we made our announcement. It has consistently done so for years. But what is new is that other countries are rejecting Russia's arguments and demonstrating support for the multi-stakeholder model. And this was on full display in April when businesses, public interest groups, technical experts, and governments met in Brazil for the Net Mundial Conference on Internet Governance. The conference gave all stakeholders the opportunity to participate in a discussion about the future of internet governance. The parties came together in 2 days and agreed that internet governance should be built on democratic, multi-stakeholder processes that ensure meaningful and accountable participation of all stakeholders, including governments, the private sector, civil society, the technical community, the academic community, and users. Now, as reported in the press, Russia spoke out against the Net Mundial consensus. But what was not as fully reported was the fact that only one other government, Iran, joined in open opposition to the outcome statement endorsed by the Net Mundial participants. We firmly believe that our announcement will help prevent any government or group of governments to take over the domain name system. Our continued stewardship of the IANA functions has been a source of friction and indeed used as an excuse by Russia and others to push for organizations such as the International Telecommunication Union to take over the IANA functions. Our announcement took that argument off the table, and it affirms the role of the global internet community, which is committed to a truly inclusive multi-stakeholder process for internet governance. Leading human rights groups agree. In a letter to Congress earlier this year, the Center for Democracy and Technology, Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, and others said that the transition could help thwart government overreach in internet governance, which would have devastating implications for human rights worldwide. Another misconception about our announcement is that some countries have used it as an excuse to clamp down on internet access in their own countries. Nothing about our role with the IANA functions can prevent countries from censoring and restricting access to the internet within their own borders. Efforts by Russia and others to limit access within their own country to information online and offline began long before our announcement. And as the Freedom House announced in its report last year, blocking access to information on entire websites, IP addresses, and particular web pages has become the most common means in Russia to restrict user activity on the internet. Now, while countries like Russia might want to export this approach worldwide, the internet's decentralized and cooperative nature would never allow it to happen. Harvard Law professor Jonathan Zittrain summed it up best in the New Republic earlier this year. He wrote, "Any attempt to impose broad-based censorship through domain name assignments would be met with stiff resistance by the operators of domain name registries and ultimately by the internet service providers who choose to consult those registries for information about what destination each name represents. Such a move would be strongly resisted by the United States government as well, because while we seek to transition out of our limited, largely clerical role with the IANA functions, we are not walking away from ICANN or exiting from the debate over internet governance. We will continue to be vocal and active players in all internet governance forums, including ICANN. Like other governments, the United States is active in ICANN's Governmental Advisory Committee. We have and will continue to be vigorous advocates within the GAC for policies that promote the openness and freedom of the internet. As one group of stakeholders in the ICANN process, governments have unique power to speak to the public interest when they speak as one based on consensus positions. And I want to pause and emphasize this point. The internet does not respect national boundaries. No one country, no 2 countries, no 10 countries can claim to speak on behalf of the public interest. This fact is reflected in the ICANN bylaws, in which governments can provide advice on public policy matters to the board, but such advice only has true power when it is presented as the consensus advice of governments. In other words, when it reflects a global view and not just the parochial view of a handful of governments. In that context, the idea that governments could enhance their influence within ICANN by changing its rules to allow for a majority vote on policy issues reflects a misunderstanding of the policy process at ICANN, as well as a misunderstanding of the meaning of the word consensus. The United States would strongly oppose any such move, and indeed any effort by governments to eliminate that requirement of consensus likely will simply weaken the role of governments within ICANN. Ultimately, ICANN's multi-stakeholder process makes it impossible for any one group to dominate discussions or impose its will, and that's the beauty of the multi-stakeholder process and why it has enabled the internet to grow and flourish. Domestically, there has been strong support for the multi-stakeholder approach. Both chambers of Congress voted unanimously in 2012 to preserve and advance the multi-stakeholder governance model under which the internet has thrived. Now, I understand that some lawmakers have concerns about the IANA transition and its potential impact on internet freedom and openness. I respect those opinions, but strongly believe congressional efforts aimed at delaying this transition would send the wrong message to the rest of the world about our commitment to the multi-stakeholder approach to governance. The unified message has traditionally been a bulwark against regulatory efforts by foreign authoritarian regimes, and it is important that we continue echoing that message and do everything we can to support the multi-stakeholder approach as the best model for promoting a free and open internet across the globe. Now, the multi-stakeholder model allows anyone the opportunity to participate and be heard. Danny, Ambassador Sepulveda, made that point in his panel that just concluded. So let's be clear, that includes all of you in this room today. So I urge all of you to show your support for this process by participating in it. We have made it crystal clear that the plan should be developed in an open and transparent manner. Now, there will be coordination out of necessity. And I referred earlier to the coordination group that will do just that, but anyone can provide input into the process, and I urge you to do so. Second, I urge you to continue to demonstrate your support for the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. As with any consensus-based organization, one will not always be able to get everything one wants, but that's the hallmark of the process. It is not a sign of failure of the process. And finally, continue to work with all of the stakeholders at ICANN to improve the accountability and transparency of the organization. I have made that commitment by personally participating in the 2 prior accountability and transparency review teams, and I encourage all of you to contribute to the accountability review as it gets organized this summer. So with that, I will close. I thank you for listening, and I assume we'll take a question or two.
Thank you. Just a second, Katie. Prerogative. I've got actually the first question, which is actually a clarifying question. So you mentioned the NTIA role in the transition. Is that the only role that is being reviewed, or is the entire IANA process being reviewed? So as I call it, the triangle of trust between the IANA function staff at ICANN, the Department of Commerce staff, which does the procedural review, and then the VeriSign staff who do the actual implementation of the change of the IANA function. Is the NTIA role the only thing that's up for grabs, or is the entire process being reviewed?
We only asked for a transition plan as affects our role. Now, I think as the coordination group gets into its work, and let me back up. I think the reason for that was, as I mentioned, one of our key conditions is maintaining security and stability. And I think that a much broader process that would have thrown up for grabs whether ICANN should continue to play the role it plays, whether VeriSign should continue in its role, did potentially threaten security and stability. So we were very precise in only asking for a transition plan for our role. It does seem, however, because of the discussion of accountability that we've seen in the community to date, that as they start parsing out these IANA functions and evaluating for whom is the function performed, what are the performance metrics that ought to apply to that, and what are the consequences for failure to meet those performance metrics, it seems that these groups will clearly get into some question of how to deal with that problem as an accountability issue. So I would expect that on the margin some of those issues would come up, but not because we asked for it.
Great. Okay. Back of the room. We have a microphone back there.
Again, I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. Just kind of on a different topic, and I guess maybe this wasn't clear before, my concern is intellectual property. And in moving forward, for things like trademarks and patents, anything along those lines, internationally protections are not quite as great as they are in the US in certain countries. And my worry is, how do we continue to protect that, or how are we involved when you look at domain names like .wine or .sucks and the integrity of a brand?
They like your question, you're not even done with it.
So, I mean, you know, how do we maintain that in some kind of new structure? How do we focus on intellectual property in the U.S. digital-based economy?
What do you mean by a new structure?
Well, I mean, if ICANN is going to not have this backdrop where we're looking at the assigned names and numbers. So I see the white pages kind of more as not necessarily just, just the white pages, but also the ability to decide what the extension is going to be. And through the extension, you have the ability to.
Okay, but let me be clear that with what we do with the IANA functions today, we don't play any role operationally in any of the issues you just talked about. Where those issues are debated and discussed is in the policy-making process in ICANN, where we participate as a member of the GAC. It's also reflected in all of the safeguards and protections that were designed around the expansion of top-level domains, specifically relating to trademark protections and intellectual property protection that you've described. And it's been a very active debate for the last 6 or 7 years within ICANN, as IP lawyers from around the world have been in these discussions trying to make sure that the kinds of systems that are put in place, and there are, I think, 2 or 3 different types of protections for intellectual property that emerged out of that apply at different steps in the process. None of that changes. That's not impacted in any respect by what we've put on the table with respect to transitioning the IANA functions.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry,
Tom had his hand up.
All right, got a couple over here. Tom.
Thank you. Larry, you indicated that the IANA transition is essentially ending the U.S., the special status of the U.S. in Internet governance. But even after the IANA transition is completed, there will be other things that give the U.S. a special status. For example, the affirmation of commitments, which is an agreement between ICANN and the U.S. government, the physical location, the fact that ICANN is located in the United States and incorporated under U.S. law. So I guess my question is, at some point, perhaps after the IANA transition is completed, why won't there be calls to end those things as well? And if one wants to be consistent, why shouldn't those things also be subject to the multi-stakeholder process?
So with respect to the affirmation of commitments, virtually everything in there that relates to ICANN responsibilities is already in their bylaws. So it's reflecting in one place, I think, capturing issues that were on people's minds back in 2009 as we evolved away from the MOU environment into the affirmation environment. So I see those as persisting and as long-lived within the ICANN process. So whether it stays in the form of an affirmation of commitments or takes some other form, I don't see those things going away at any point in time. I think I certainly have heard desire to rationalize this constant cycling of reviews that are mandated under the affirmation because there are also separate reviews on different cycle times that are mandated in the bylaws, and at some point it probably makes sense to rationalize that, but the fundamental principles of accountability and transparency and the other commitments reflected in the who is evaluations, the consumer evaluations, those will persist and I think live on beyond that. With respect to where they're operating, I think ICANN's customers probably have an even greater need and desire that ICANN remain a U.S. company than perhaps even we do. So even if I think it went to the community, I can predict the outcome of that discussion.
I have a question from the Twitter feed. It's Baron Souza at Tech Freedoms asking if the Department of Commerce has looked at if IANA is U.S. property, and if you have looked at that, are you going to make that information public?
I commented on that in my remarks. No, there's no asset that we have ownership of in this regard.
It just saved me 5 minutes of my life not to have to explain that to Baron, so thank you. As you just saved me 5 minutes of my life not having to explain that to Baron that I didn't ask the question. Sorry, we'll be back in a second. In the back here?
Sorry.
You can
Well,
by microphone.
I'm going to basically reinforce what I just did there, how big of an idiot I am by asking this question. But
and you are who, so we all know.
Yeah, Marcus Hedenberg with Broadband Census. As someone who's pretty new to learning about ICANN, if this is too basic and too long to explain, you don't have to answer it. But you talk about the multi-stakeholder process, why it's important, and how, among other things, it promotes free and open expression of the internet. Can you talk about who some of those specific multi-stakeholders are, and what are some of the specific decisions that are made that you think are important? Just examples, I guess.
All right, so how many people in this room have been to an ICANN meeting and participated? All right, so look around. Here's a bunch of your stakeholders right here in the room. And it's made up of people from the business community, from civil society, from academics. The point is, and the beauty of the process is anybody can participate. There's no certification that you have to pass to get in the door. There's no entry fee you have to pay to get in the door. There's nobody you have to know in the government to get into the door. And that's, we think, has been the strength of this because it encourages all manner of innovative ideas that can come from anywhere as opposed to people who, for whatever reason, have been the select few.
Over here, the guy with the pink tie.
Hi, Larry. Jim Prendergast with Galway Strategy Group. If I can ask you to sort of look into the future, say 12 months from now, the process has run its course, the community's come up with a proposal. Can you describe what the process will look like then as far as how NTIA is going to evaluate the proposal, how you're going to answer questions like, is it satisfactory to IANA customers and things like that?
So there'll obviously be quite a large and continuing discussion about the proposal. I think through its process of being put together and through a review that will be conducted once it hits here in Washington, I'm confident because Chairman Walden told me so last week. I'm sure I'll be up with another hearing, having a chat with all the members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee about this, and probably other committees as well, just because of the importance of this and the interest in it. So I think what's key, and I keep reminding reminding on these points, emphasizing these points when I speak publicly, and I think the good news is, whether they're listening to me or not, the coordination group is certainly picking up on these points, but maybe it's because they're just so obvious anybody would pick up on them. It's critical that we have a thorough and open and inclusive process. I think the thing that will damage this process more than anything else is to get near the end and have somebody say, nobody listened to me. I didn't have a chance to be heard. I think if they can present a record to us that shows that everyone had a chance to participate, all ideas were considered, if they can show that they've thought through Steve's worst case scenarios and stress tested it, all of that I think strengthens the document. so that when it gets here and people start asking questions, the answers are easily available and are apparent to all. So last week, Chairman Walden, and to his credit, he had read the IANA contract and talked about this at the US IGF, and he went through and talked about some of the commitments that ICANN makes in that contract in terms of accountability and performance of the IANA functions. Well, I think it's obvious that the coordination group and the stakeholders who are part of it are going to go through every one of those provisions and make sure that they're reproduced and probably strengthened and made stronger in whatever plan emerges out of that. But it's key that they do things like that, the kind of basic blocking and tackling, to show that they've really thought it through.
There's a question over here. Sorry, behind David will take it next.
Hi, just to clarify, that's an ambassador. I don't know what Steve does, but they're not just anybody. I actually subscribe to the ICANN updates. They come out with a 2-week framed window, very short and very fast, just so you're aware of that. My point is, though,
I'm sorry, but I get a thing every day from ICANN that people can sign up for.
But if they want to comment, it's like a 2-week window to file an answer. It's
you mean
very
want to
short.
comment?
Yeah. And then there's no follow-up as to what happened. So that's my input as a multi-stakeholder.
But I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the process that's being put in place for the transition plan isn't being run by ICANN. It's being run by this coordination group. So
yeah, just addressing about multi-stakeholders, and everybody can subscribe to your list and get the updates also. I learned that into the point. My point here is ICANN started with government employees that were being paid by the government and had access to our private data. The Hollerith punch card machine, which began as, which emerged into IBM, also began with government employees who had a better idea and then took it private. One, I would assume that there would be a work for hire contract, that our data would not become the nucleus of someone's private effort. And also, is this what we're supposed to continue to expect, that government employees come in, get paid to think and make something think and work better, and then go off and take it private?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to, people taking it private, but the history of American innovation is filled with examples where government has primed the pump on technology and innovation that has then been exploited by private industry. I mean, all of you guys have got GPS in your cell phone, so that is entirely the product of the U.S. government having put satellites up there for the GPS. It's a gift from the government to anybody who can use it or make money off of it. So I'm not sure what the
Our private information is core to what's going on with ICANN. Our private information was what, as I understand it, was also what was core to when IBM.
What private information are you referring to that would
Well, when I file into whois.com, which is an IANA an ICANN group, I put in my name, my address, I'm showing my ISPs. There's anything, you know, whatever I do from a domain aspect has a way of being tracked. That's me.
So you own a web name yourself?
Do I want to what?
I say you are a website owner yourself?
I am. I am active on the internet, and I'm not comfortable with being tracked or being told after the fact. I'm okay if someone, and this is something I write about quite actively. I'm Carrie Devra, Center for Copyright Integrity. I want to know in advance. I want to know before I enter a page. I want something, and I'm known for saying this, upper right-hand corner where I can see when I enter onto a page. It tells me what's going to happen. You will be tracked. I don't want a toss that's at the bottom of the page, or if you're only the type like me that will go through every page of a website to see where the pitfalls are and where the information goes. I want that disclosure at the beginning. The Hollerith punch card machine is something a lot of people don't know about. It started in Georgetown. It's what became IBM. It was developed by government employees who said, we made this work. This is an awesome idea. And then they left the government and they took that idea and made a company out of it. And that's why I said, we become, when we give our data in trust to the US government, we're not thinking that someone that we're paying a salary for is going to say, I can do this better, let me exit and let me try to be a solopreneur or an entrepreneur.
Okay, thank you for your comment.
David, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. David McCauley with Bloomberg BNA. I just have a nuts and bolts process question. If, and I don't know government contracting procedures, if the Okay, sorry. If the coordination group is unable to deliver an acceptable plan by September of 2015, is the NTIA able to agree an extension that would be 2 years or less if an acceptable plan comes in less time?
So the option period is 2 years. So it would be exercised for 2 years. But if you're asking the hypothetical, well, but what if the plan comes in 3 months later? I think we would deal with that if and when we had that situation to deal with. I said we'd deal with it if the situation presents itself.
And I'm going to take this as the last question right here. We've got Phil Corwin.
Thank you. Secretary Strickland, something rather remarkable happened at the ICANN meeting in London last month. For the first time in ICANN's history, all the constituencies within the GNSO agreed on a common position, and that common position was calling for an independent accountability mechanism and structure to be developed as part of the IANA transition, and they asked the ICANN board and staff to, quoting, to fulfill their obligations to support this community-driven multi-stakeholder initiative. Now, I believe I heard you say in your remarks that the U.S. did view enhanced accountability as part of what needed to be done in this IANA transition, so I just wanted to get confirmation that the NTA is in support of this community initiative and wants to see this community-developed, stakeholder-developed accountability enhancement accompany the IANA transition proposal.
So yes, we believe that ought to be a multi-stakeholder process as well that has engagement from the community. I will say that this is a topic that I think would benefit from the involvement of experts, particularly experts on governance from outside of the ICANN family, and I know ICANN has suggested that in terms of trying to attract people to engage on the project who can bring that kind of expertise to this, because these are not easy questions that are being dealt with. And I've commented before that the idea of creating yet another new body, if that's what is being advocated by that communique that you just read from, I think raises a whole new set of accountability questions, which is, well, who are those people accountable to? I do think there's a lot that could be done in terms of looking at better board accountability, particularly for those members who are representing or who are appointed by particular constituencies. There's no recall mechanism right now for a supporting organization to recall a board member if something goes wrong, and it does seem like that is an obvious area of inquiry and evaluation as that second group gets underway.
Great. Could everybody help me thank Secretary Strickland for spending the morning with us? Thank you all for your time this morning, and as I remind you that we have a Tech Policy Daily you can read on our website, and if you want to join the dialogue, please join the AEI Tech email list, and we'll love to have a dialogue with you. Bye-bye.